announcements. Let me get my pen because I need to write notes when Dr. Lisa is speaking. I have a couple of announcements that tomorrow, the Palestine course tomorrow, which for you, it's okay, you're tired. Palestine course tomorrow at 7 p.m. We are really very, 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 very proud to announce that Madonna Thunderhawk herself is going to be speaking in the class tomorrow. She's going, and she wants to speak about her trip to Palestine. So she's here. If you have time, go to the Roxy Theater, see the film, The Warrior Women, which is about Standing Rock. It's an amazing film. And I think once they've shown it different places and raised the money to cover the cost and so on, we will bring it to San Francisco State and have a discussion, because it actually talks about how the movement around, actually not only the movement around Standing Rock, because they begin by talking about the boarding schools where indigenous kids were kidnapped from their families and placed in, and what happened with the schools, how they were not allowed to speak their language. And I mean, it's also a lot of the similarities with Palestine, okay? But also they talk about the whole organizing and the women organizing with each other, and it's really fascinating. And it's fascinating to have this amazing person who's been around, like from the 60s with the American Indian movement, like leading, organizing, going together, make sure the food is around. I mean, all of this stuff, that's real leadership. It's not leadership of people who kind of like stick in places and give orders to everybody to kind of go do what they want. So she's going to be speaking tomorrow in our class. I want to remind you also that on the October 25th, it also constitutes work for your class if you want to report. We're going to be having the event jointly with the California Coalition for Women Prisoners at 518 Valencia in the evening, about the whole question of repression and prisoners in Palestine and in the US. And so please come. We're going to do a slideshow about our trips to Palestine, the prisoners, talking with the prisoners, and the history of prisons and so on. And then on November 1st is going to be the anniversary of the Palestinian mural, and it's going to be in Jack Adams Hall. And the mural anniversary this year is focusing on Jerusalem. So as you know, in the Palestinian mural, there is multiple signs of Jerusalem. Edward Said was from Jerusalem. His home was taken over by Zionist groups. And they used to have a sign on the house, says this is the house of Edward Said, but they removed it. And when we went on a tour to his house, we were told by the people who were giving us the tour that the sign has been removed, because a lot of tourists would come and check and say, oh, this is Edward Said's house. So to erase any Palestinian connection, they removed the signs. So and also we have on the mural, if you see the Dome of the Rock, we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we're going to be talking about Jerusalem, and we have people from various delegations who went to Jerusalem. We've met with the Afro-Palestinian community, we've met with former prisoners, we've met with people whose children were killed, including Muhammad Abu Khdeir's parents, the kid who was forced to drink kerosene and then he was set and burned alive. So we will be talking about that, and we will also be talking about the people who are actually staying put and refusing to leave their homes and so on. I mean, so we're not going to be only talking about repression. We want to talk about resistance. We want to talk about the cultural aspects of it. We want to talk about the history. So there is multiple things that we will be doing on them. And I'm saying we because I'm the advisor to GOV, so I'm also going to be speaking on Jerusalem that day. So please join. And so these are, and I think this is going to be the last open classroom for a while. There's a lot of other events are happening and so on. If you need to talk with me and if you need to meet with me and so on, we can set up Zoom. We are thinking, like Salim and I were thinking about like doing maybe some classes on Zoom, getting together because we have the time to just have a conversation, discussion, figure out what topics we want to talk about, where people want to go with their research and so on. So do you have any questions about anything about requirements? Are you good? We can turn off the video. Okay, shut it down. By History of San Francisco, as my friend and my brother Tony Gonzalez from the American Indian movement says, too little, too late, with San Francisco being one of the last cities to do this, which is supposed to be one of the early cities. The importance of it is as we talked about 1492 and what has happened and so on, we will have more discussions about it, is that the acknowledgement one day is not enough. All days are indigenous people's days. This is indigenous land. And as we had the discussion last week, right? It was last week. So, but also there have been a lot of things, like yesterday, I think also in New York, the decolonized movement, which is some kind of cultural jamming movement, also went against the Rockefeller, the Museum of Natural History, where they have this Rockefeller statue with submissive African Americans and indigenous people and so on. They've done this, I think last year, they've done this as well. So it's important for us to be thinking about that. Also last week, as you remember, it was the 50th anniversary of the massacre in Mexico. We had discussion about it. And so without further ado, today is, I'm very happy to introduce and welcome my colleague, my comrade, my friend, Professor Blanca Mise, who is in the French department, and her knowledge, her expertise, her wisdom goes beyond everything. Professor Mise is assistant professor. She's joined us in 2016. She finished her PhD at UC Berkeley. She was very active at UC Berkeley with local UAW Local 2865, which was the graduate student union. That was very active, very democratically based, amazing graduate student union, negotiate the rights of students to be treated as workers, respected as workers. And she joined San Francisco State and immediately plunged into the action. She researches 19th century, 18th century French, 18th century French, but she's, as I said, she does all sorts of things. She is originally from Barcelona, Catalonian. And I'm going to let you talk about, because you should be talking about your family, to expand more about that, because one of the things we're doing in this class is oral histories. So we're talking about people, and when we say oral histories and we say elders, we don't talk about only people who are in their 60s and 70s. To some of you, they sound so old. I'm in my 60s. I don't feel like I'm so old. Okay, I feel like I'm very young. I'm going to continue until I drop. Okay, and we all will do that. But also, it's the people who have had experiences and so on. So one of the things is also compile oral histories as we go. It's history in the making. It's histories in the making. So I would like, so she will be speaking about some of the histories that we think are not related. And I say we, I don't think people in this class, but in general, in the academy, people say, what does the Spanish Civil War have to do with Palestine? What does Catalonian independence have to do with Palestine? What does the Basque movement have to do with Palestine? What's the connection? What does it have to do with Mexico? What's the connection? And people say, it's a very, very long connection. And then there is the Tres Culturas in Mexico, and it's very interesting because in Seville last year, when we were there in summer, Tres Culturas talk about Muslims, Christians, and Jews, as if there are no other cultures. I mean, like Tres Culturas, Tres religions, I don't know. It's very, very interesting, and I kind of like have a conversation with you about that. And so now in Mexico, it's Tres Culturas, right? It's very, very interesting because it's indigenous, Spanish, and what's the third one? The Tres Culturas in Mexico that people keep saying that no, it's indigenous, Spanish.
American.
No. There is a third one, but it was to me it was very interesting because like the slavery was not acknowledged. You can look it up. I will look it up. I found it. I have this short-term memory loss, so I'm not remembering every single thing. But anyway, so we're going to be talking about that. She will be speaking. I will speak about some of the things that are relevant to Palestine and the history and so on. Okay, you can join us. You can sit over there. So you, yeah. Just sit over here, between
in the corner.
No, because I asked him to speak and he said he doesn't want
I will go to
but
the
of course
corner.
he's going to interject, yeah.
No, I'm not gonna take.
Okay, you're on video, by the way.
I'm walking in coffee.
Okay, all right. So without further ado, do you want me to say more about
No.
Okay. Can you please say a little bit? Actually, let's have the students just go around and say your name and your name, major, minor, so we know who's there. So why don't we start with Alejandro?
Alejandro Aguilar, journalism major, Ahmed minor, he, him pronouns. And funny thing is, in my high school, there was one sentence about the Spanish Civil War in our history book. So I asked the teacher if I could do a whole presentation on it, and she let me do it. And so yeah, just
is Carissa, and I'm a astrophysics major.
My name is Tikali. I'm a political science major.
My name is Jonathan, and I'm a Latino studies major.
My name is Tamara, and I'm a Latinx studies major. My name is Ebony. I'm a Latinx studies major, and I'm minoring in the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora initiative studies. My name
It's no longer initiative, it's a studies.
Oh, it's a
because we
studies
have a
now.
program at the minor. Yeah.
My name is Bella. I'm an anthropology major. I'm a minor.
Okay, and
My name is Layla. I am one of Dr. Abdulhadi's interns, and I'm live streaming the class.
yes, and you finished your BA at
Yes, I did my BA at UCLA. I graduated in 2017, and I wrote my undergrad thesis on homophobia in Afghanistan and Iran, and how it's a Western construct.
I'm Rivera, retired trade unionist, visiting attempt this college.
And I actually did say I wanted you to talk about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the
Oh, you
Spanish
did?
Civil War. So if you will call on you, but
Yeah.
after Blanca's presentation.
So,
Okay, so
okay, so my name is Blanca Mise. I teach here since 2016. I come from Barcelona. My father is Catalan and my mom is not. She's from region called Bierzo, which is close to León and the border with Galicia, which we could get into.
yeah.
Has its own
Yeah.
movement of self-determination. So, my relation with Catalonia is very complicated. If one could say why you were born in Catalonia, right? The first one is because, well, in my family, my father is Catalan and my mom is not, and I've seen all my childhood a certain degree of discrimination from my Catalan family towards my mom because she was not Catalan, and we'll go into that. And the second thing is because I was born just after the end of the dictatorship, a few years after. Spain had a very long dictatorship, not the longest because Portugal beat us with Salazar, more than 40 years of dictatorship, and in Spain we have 37, which is quite a lot, and which ended in 78, 79, and I was born in 84. And when I was born, my parents were, the public school system, like as a secular system, was still in the making. Like what it would be to have a non-Catholic public school system was like a big thing to be discussed in Spain. So my father put me in a French school because the French school was a public school in Spain. So the ideology of the school was a secular school, was a public school, but most of the kids were not French. And it was so for us we had to pay, but it was pretty cheap, right? But the idea was to be in a school that would be providing good education with democratic values and secular values for my parents. And so that became so that strange thing for me is that I grew up with several cultures. And I don't want to say they intersect in this kind of like multicultural way.
Yeah.
I would just say that there was not room for all of them. Because I started speaking French since I was 4 years old, and my parents don't speak French. It's kind of a crazy thing to be going to school and speak one language, right? And be at home and speak another language, and your parents have no fucking idea what's happening in the classroom. So they cannot help you with homework, they cannot go to the teacher parents, And of course, French culture at the time was perceived as to be superior to anything produced in the peninsula. I never forget this sentence I heard when I went to study later in my life to Paris, and one of my classmates told me, I was in a very prestigious school at the time, "Oh, do you know what we say about people in Spain?" I say, "No." When people said, "You brace yourself for the worst," and say, "Well, we say that Africa begins in the Pyrenees, right? So you are like savages." So just to understand the idea of Europe, it's not an homogeneous idea. Part of the thing I want to do today is to deconstruct this idea of Spain and Europe, of nation states, right? Because if we don't understand the history and the contradictions beneath them. And so, I was going to a French school it was a very top-down, elitist system, very rigorous. So part of the reason I'm here today is because I got a very rigorous academic training, very rigorous, for those who made it through, right? For those who could sustain a certain degree of cultural alienation. And so I was going to school every day, partially to be instructed, but also partially to be civilized by the And at home, you know, I had two other cultures, the Spanish culture and the Catalan culture, but the cultures I really didn't fully inherit because of the weight of the dictatorship. And you know, everybody has a different story. But in my case, the weight of the dictatorship meant that my father, who's Catalan, never really properly learned how to write in Catalan. He's a journalist, now retired. So we spoke in Catalan, but I've never really learned to read Catalan or like have a literacy in Catalan, and I was in a French school. So Catalan was a fourth language. So we study everything is in French, all the topics, and then we study Spanish and English as foreign languages. And then we have a third foreign language, which is regional language, which I only saw Catalan written for the first time when I was 12 years old. So I have a very low literacy in one of my native languages, and it's a big source of shame for me. It's shameful not to be able to write to your aunt without doing spelling mistakes or conjugating properly the verbs when you have a PhD from UC Berkeley, right? It's kind of like a difficult thing to grasp around. And so, but that's not just my story, that's the story of a whole people whose language and culture was not in the institutions. And you know, at the time I was growing up, if I had gone to a Spanish school, I would have learned Catalan. But my parents put me in a French school because they wanted, you know, so they had to make some choices. So you could not have quality public education, secular, which is very important, democratic, which is very important, and have it in your own language, because in the 80s, Spain was in this kind of chaos, trying to understand what does it mean to be a modern and democratic system country today. So, you know, after I went to this French school, and I, you know, kind of like learned French and a little bit of English, and I was doing pretty much okay in Spanish, but my Catalan was iffy, and then I went to study in France, and I went to very competitive education system. I don't want to enter in the details of that, but I spent 5 years living in Paris. And then I came to the US, which I had to, again, learn English. I mean, you know, my English was very shitty, and it was very hard to be in grad school and reading all these books, writing all the papers in another new language, and still I don't master Catalan. So we told me, well, you're Catalan. I said, well, I'm somehow Catalan, but I've lived now so many years outside of my own country, and it's not that I was really into the Catalan culture. Right? One of the important things of why this question of Spanish or Catalan heritage is also a difficult heritage is because of the dictatorship and the stigma that came with certain things. There's two big, and I'll talk about this later, two big social, how do you say, weights and heritage that are behind it. One is people who rise against the dictatorship to defend rights of Catalans that were jailed or persecuted. And, you know, and I'm sure you're learning in this class that when the state represses you and sends you to jail, the social feeling around your family and you is not necessarily one of pride, but it's one of shame. It's like you're casting shame on the family. For 3 years, because he was in a Maoist group organizing against the dictatorship. And so the whole idea about all of his past and his heritage was something we didn't talk about in the family. But the other social weight that people who live in Catalonia and Spain carry is that of economic migration and that follow civil war. You know, civil war destroyed Spain, destroyed its capacity of production, its agriculture, right? From 36 to 39. And I'll talk a little bit about the history later. But there was a massive economic migration from the southern Spain, from Andalusia, Extremadura, Murcia, right? To come and work into the industrialized regions, which at the time were Catalonia, Barcelona, the industrial area, Cordon, next to Barcelona, the Basque country, Bilbao, and Madrid. And so all of these immigrants who spoke Spanish were racialized by the Catalan bourgeoisie as being the poor, illiterate peasants who speak Spanish. And there was because of the weight of discrimination and oppression against Catalans, there was an attempt to distinguish themselves from the Catalans who had money to say, we have culture and you don't. So, I mean, we see this in this country, right? The Olympics of oppression, those who have a little bit better, right? Like they just spit on the ones who just came here. So you have inside of the Latino community a lot of tensions inside of the, you know, like it's not new. So that was also, so then, you know, there are a lot of people in Catalonia who don't speak Catalan because they're families are Spanish speaking, who are working class immigrants who live in the most poor neighborhoods and who are not considered as fully civilized, cultured subjects because they're working class people. And that was by the Catalonian bourgeoisie, and then unfortunately by some sectors of the Catalonian intelligentsia, right, of the middle class. And that's a case of my family, but I have a friend here at Berkeley who's a lecturer who teaches Catalan, and she comes from one of those families, and she teaches Catalan because she knows Catalan, but she does not identify as Catalan because Catalonia did not identify her as Catalan, but as the other, or as the other that had to mend with an impossible thing to mend, which is centuries of oppression. In order to, it became this kind of difficult thing. So that's my personal story. I'm here, and I'm just one of the things that is difficult for me is I feel like I'm losing any kind of identity the more I live in this country because my Catalan is not getting better. My Spanish now is decolonized because I live with an Argentinian and I talk with Mexicans and Colombians and Puerto Ricans, so my accent is not Spanish anymore. My French is kind of going down the drain. My English will never be good. So I just feel like but it's this is also and I'm fine with it. I love it, and I don't suffer from it. But it's just but I just feel like when if you ask someone else to tell how Catalan they are, they will give you a very different narrative. And I have to be honest with you. I say, I was born in Catalonia, and I have a lot of things to say about what's been going on in Catalonia, but also with all this complicated histories we all inherit. And so I thought maybe
before you move on to another part of the 100,000 things I asked you to speak about.
Yeah.
You can talk about the whole question of the referendum and the independence movement.
Yeah. So, I was thinking of maybe doing a little bit of a history of things that have happened.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
However you want to.
Yeah. So, I like this thing that you can write on the board. So
I don't know. Can you put
Yeah,
on
you
this
can.
board?
Yeah, you can.
No, because
Yeah, you
the
can.
library, remember the library?
So, I was just going to do three blocks. Oh my God, this is not good.
Okay.
I have to.
So what we saw last year on the demonstrations for the referendum, I think was in the national news, related to the recent history of the Catalan movement, which I would say begins in 2006. But it's impossible to understand why suddenly Catalan people are crazy about taking in the streets and voting for something if you don't understand what has happened. And so I don't want to, I cannot summarize accurately all of this, but maybe we can talk briefly about this date, 1492, which is very relevant because of the
Yes.
colonization and genocide that the Spanish, Castilian monarchy carried. But it's also the date of the constitution of the Spanish state as we know it, right? The idea of Spain did not exist before that date. It was not and when it existed initially through a marriage of two different trends of monarchy. You had Isabel la Católica, right? From the Reino de Castilla. Sorry, I didn't prepare a PowerPoint. So
It's okay.
Old school things. And you have Fernando de Aragón, from the Reino de Aragón. And so what happened is that these two people married and they created a united kingdom, which is not today as Spain. But this kingdom, when it was created, had the understanding that the different laws and constitutions of the two kingdoms would be preserved. Okay, so when the Spanish state emerged, there was a kind of a federation of two kingdoms that so the son of these two, it will inherit the whole thing,
Mhm.
but that the rights of the Reino de Aragon, so Aragon is a region that today encompasses Catalonia, but also Aragon and a big region of the Mediterranean, that they're, what at the time was called fueros, which are the local rights, the fueros, would be respected. And that was how things went. So the Spanish, the Castilian kingdom was the one that financed the expeditions of Cristobal Colon, and so was the one who owned the land in America. So the Aragon kingdom did not benefit economically, was forbidden to make business with America because it was the monopoly of Castilla. So you know there were two different economic units, there were two different, let's say, legal units that just happened to be under the same monarch, but they were understanding almost a separate country. Like nothing had happened after these guys married in the everyday life. Like people who live in Aragon were in the Reino de Aragon and they had their own customs and their own thing, right? But what did happen is that the genocide and the overexploitation of America, which vastly enriched the Reino de Castilla, was something that the Reino de Aragon could not benefit from. And so that had very important consequences. Why? Because one of the reasons why the regions today in Spain that are the most industrialized, they're Catalonia and they're the Basque Country, is because they could not benefit from that direct extraction of gold. They had to find other ways to accumulate capital, and they did it through commercial exchange in the Mediterranean. And so actually, when the big story, the Castilians who thought they were the kings of the world, because then the son of these two guys was Carlos I, right?
Mhm.
Carlos I, when I was going to school, even if it was in the French school, I was taught by some of the Spanish faculty we had that taught us 1 hour of Spanish culture, that the greatness and the privilege we had to be Spanish because we come from a big empire of Carlos I, which is the empire where the sun never goes down because they're on land all over the world, and we should feel very grateful for that. So, we have to celebrate the anniversary of the colonization and genocide and things like that.
Can I just to connect with
Yeah.
other things, is that part of the reason that they came together was because they were trying to also compete with
Yeah.
the English,
Yes.
because the English also was the empire that on whose everybody's empire the sun never sets.
Yeah.
Okay, because they go across multiple time zones basically, and so they were trying to compete with that. So one of the reasons that they financed Christopher Columbus was to actually go and see how they can get around to what they thought India, because they will compete with India. And this is also when he got lost. That's why it's called West Indies. It's not
Mhm.
actually Indian. But do you want to talk about Andalusia? You're going to talk about Andalusia, 1492, and so on.
A little bit, but
Okay, all right. Well, yeah.
Yeah,
I just wanted to just inject this. Yeah.
I just want to say, so this state that got consolidated in a contradictory fashion, right? There was this alliance which maintained the separation, but it was also a very racist turn of cleaning Spain of the other cultures.
Mhm.
So, 700 years before this half of the Iberian Peninsula was living under the Arab dynasty of the Umayyads, I think, right?
Yes.
And when the Isabella Católica reconquered the territory, they thought that they had to make sure it was Christianized and of pure blood, so they expelled all Jews and Muslims, and it was not even an option of being Protestant the years after, So it became this kind of idea.
And actually, before they expelled, there was the Inquisition
There was Inquisition.
of the
yeah.
Muslims and Jews,
Yeah.
and also the conversion, the forced conversion.
Yeah, you have to
Yes,
convert
yeah.
if you want to stay, if not, you go out. So you have this very racist state with one religion constituted, which still has these differences. And the Catalans, at the time they weren't Aragoneses, the Catalan identity didn't exist as such at the time, began to have to find other means to develop themselves economically. So they were the first ones by the beginning of the 18th century who industrialized the country, right? So the the heirs of the Reino de Castilla were using all of the money they had stolen from America to buy land, because they had this idea that they had to buy land. But then they were not using the money to invest it to make money. They were not capitalists, right? They were just buying land. And so all the money just went to Northern Europe. That's why the Industrial Revolution happened in Northern Europe, is a process of what Marx called the process of primitive accumulation, right? So what Castilla did, it stole the money, and it invested wrongly, and it ended up in the hands of the Germans, the French, and the British. But I don't want to talk too much about that. I want to talk about what, because I'm interested in the history of Catalonia today, is that Carlos I, who was the emperor of this huge empire, had the understanding that this was just a deal to put different pieces of land together, but he had to respect them. And so he had what we call corte itinerante. So he will siege and rule and move the government from country to country. But when he died, he had no direct heirs. And there's another dynasty that came in, which is the French dynasty of los Borbones, which is the ones we have today. Which they all look alike because they reproduce among themselves. Right? This is also so it's okay, it's okay. I don't have to go to jail for this. Like, well, don't need the rapper. I will go to jail. Okay, so the Borbones came with the idea of a centralized state. Okay, and so they pick the center of the country, Madrid, as a capital. Madrid was a tiny, tiny town. Okay, no important for anything. Before the Borbones, and that was Felipe, like the one we have now, but older. So before they arrived, there was no capital because Carlos was moving, and the Bourbon tradition said, okay, this is a country, this is one state, what is all these different laws here? We need a capital, it needs to be in the geometrical middle of the, so they took the map and said, what is the middle of the peninsula? Madrid, this is gonna be the capital, tiny town. Just construction, make it big, make it beautiful. And also we need to find a different capital than the one of the Arab kingdom hub, which was Toledo. So you cannot, the real geometrical center is Toledo.
Yeah.
But you cannot just go to Toledo because they have all this beautiful Arab architecture and culture and Jewish culture, and just said like, no. So we need to pick the tiny town and make it more beautiful than Toledo. So what happened when Bourbon arrived is that he started undermining the rights, the fueros of the people of Aragon, and say, you know what, this is now one country, this is one state, and we're setting all the laws here in Madrid, and you have to obey by it. And the Catalans or the Aragoneses became increasingly unhappy because they say, okay, so what is the benefit for us to be in this state? You're making all this business with the trades and the deals with America, but we cannot be part of it because we are not part of Castilla, but at the same time, you're telling us how we need to rule. Oh, you have a question?
Well, yeah, just real quick so I don't get lost. Where's Catalonia, like, in the picture of the Reino de Castilla?
It's Aragon.
Oh.
It's inside Aragon.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Catalonia is a part of this.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's begin to be some kind of rebellion, and the rebellion clashes when in 1716 there is a war between the Borbones and the Habsburg dynasty, which is what today is Germany. And in this war, the Catalans, the Aragoneses, take the side of the Habsburg against the Spanish, against the Castilians. They take the other side because they say, like, if we, it's the same story. Have you heard about the story of the liberation of Haiti by Toussaint Louverture, right? That the first slave, right? What Toussaint did is, like, he sided with the Spanish against the French, and then with the French against the Spanish, and because he just said we need to defeat one at a time, right? And so the Catalans sided with the Habsburg dynasty against their own government. Okay, they were taking the arms against their own government, and they lost. And because when they lost, then Bourbon, the Felipe V, which was in power, said, now you're gonna pay for it because you betrayers, you treasoners, you went with the Germans against us. And so the day they lost was September 11th, which is the day of which is the day of Catalan, National Day of Catalonia. I think we're the only nation that celebrates a defeat, right? So the day, the Dia Nacional de Catalunya, which is September 11th, is the commemoration of the defeat against the troops of the Borbones. And so in response of this betrayal that the Castilians saw as a betrayal, they issued a series of laws which are called El Decreto de Nueva Planta. The Decreto Nueva Planta was basically legally erasing all the specific rights and protections and institutions of the Catalan people. Like that's it's institutionalized. Like you are subjects of the Castilian Empire. Okay. So what happened is like, you know, in the meantime, all the 18th century, I'm just doing very fast forward.
And this is in September 11th, 1760.
Yes, yeah. So the result of the defeat. And so all the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, what happened is like you have this decaying monarchy, right, who's still in power. Okay, decaying monarchy in power. The Catalan bourgeoisie, which was beat down and repressed, starts accumulating money and developing faster than the bourgeoisie here. And the Basque bourgeoisie starts accumulating money and developing, there's a lot of mines of coal and like all the naval ship construction in the northern Spain, in Basque country. So suddenly you have this situation where you have an economic development of oppressed nationalities. That's very important, and it's a part of what I call like contradictions, right? You have an economic development that usually could be like the one who is ruling develops more than the one who is oppressed. What happened in Spain is that the ones who were oppressed developed, the ruling class developed faster and stronger, or at least in a way it could compete with the ones of the state, the representative of the state. And so contradictions begin, because this monarchy that begins to have a lot of problems and loses, of course, all of its colonies, because you know that at the beginning of the 19th century, the big revolutions for liberation happened in Latin America, right? With Simón Bolívar and all of the liberation, you know, with Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, all of that became independent. So these guys begin to enter into big crisis. We're losing the colonies, and then they lost Cuba and the Philippines in 1898. So they're like in big crisis. What's happening to the Spanish Empire? You have the Catalans developing economically, making business, building factories, railroads, having beautiful cities, the same with the Basque. So there is a big social, economic, political crisis of this decaying monarchy in Spain. And so that led to 1931, 1936, which was the Republic. The monarchy is overthrown by a new progressive bourgeoisie that proclaims the Second Republic. And in this Second Republic, which is a political revolution that kicks the monarchy out, the problem of oppressed nationalities resurfaces. And the Catalans say, well, now that we're not going to have a king, we would like to restore our old rights that we used to have. And we would like to have our own government and our own parliament. Because we don't recognize, we don't feel we're Spanish. We feel we're Catalan, we're Aragoneses, we don't have anything to do with this culture. And so they create their own government in Catalonia, which is called Generalitat. Generalitat is the name of the Catalan government, Generalitat de Catalunya. So they institute, the whole directions are institute.
This is after the Republicans won.
Yeah, after 31.
Okay.
So in 31, there's a lot of things happening. There is the Agrarian Reform, right? Because like the majority of land was owned by these very few landowners, and most of the peasants were working, they were braceros, they were hired by the day, like what, you know, like the Central Valley here, right? Like the workers are not unionized, and they go there and they just get picked the day of, the day laborers, right? The same situation. So there was a land reform, there was the question of giving rights to oppressed nationalities, and there were the social demands of like wages and healthcare and social security, you know, like that. All of these starts, once you take the dictatorship out, the monarchy out, all of these things begin to surface. At the same time, also in Spain, there is a rise of fascism, right? So everything is in the 30s, like here. And so you think, okay, so now the Catalans have the republic, they're going to be able to restore and find a way of a federal state. That was really, that we have to be a federal state with the rest of it. But you know that in 36 is the beginning of the Civil War, right? So then the reactionary forces of the country, backed by the Catholic Church and the landowners and the military and the monarchical forces, say, no way to this democratic elected republic. This is too many changes. What are you doing? You know, like giving the land to the peasants, giving the rights to the Catalans, giving women the right to vote, like doing all these public education programs. Like, this is insane. We want to go back to the real order. We want to restore the greatness of Spain. Greatness, huh? Make America great again. Greatness. And then so they begin, they do a civil war, which is 3 years, which has the backing of Germany.
So it was the alliance in the Civil War where the
military, church, landowners,
okay.
and the and the monarchists. And the bourgeoisie was split, but there's a big sector of the bourgeoisie that was liberal bourgeoisie. They want to have let's be like the rest of the European countries. Yeah.
So what was the name of the government that was, or was it the Republicans that were implementing like the reform?
Well, there was many political parties among the Republicans.
Okay.
Because when you have a monarchy, you don't need political parties. So when you have a republic, you have elections, you need political parties. So there were different kinds of government in this city. There was a left-wing government, a right-wing government, and a super left-wing government. So the first government was kind of liberal, very tempered, and then people were pushing for reforms, and they started doing a little bit, and then you had a conservative government, and then you had the one that got elected in 36, which, why it was the beginning of the Civil War, is in 36, the Popular Front gets elected, which is a coalition of the socialists, the communists, and the radicals, like in France. And that's when the other says, oh, no. These guys, like, first they want democracy and kick out the king, and then and now these guys are going to be in power. This is going to be the end of it, you know? And so that's why
Communist and
the radical party,
okay.
the radical, yeah, which is some kind of liberal bourgeoisie, middle class.
Which
party.
is like the September 11th, 1973, when Allende was.
Exactly.
overthrown.
Yeah.
Also, it was a popular.
Yeah,
front.
it's a popular front, very not different. But you know, during the Civil War, the Civil War was still, you know, vastly unexplored by historians because it was something we couldn't talk about for many years. But basically, the fascist side got the active support.
Just say why it's fascist.
Oh, because they said they were.
I mean, explain.
Yeah. So the fascist, the fascists in Spain were called falangistas. Is the name they had, but they were like super.
Okay. Yes. Hold on a minute. What are you going to say?
Well, that's not phalangists, right? Falangistas
Yeah.
sounds like the fascist, like right-wing Christian fascists of Lebanon.
Right-wing fascist in Lebanon. Yeah. Don't
Right.
say Christian,
Right.
But yes, that they actually were inspired by Franco's phalange.
Oh, really?
They were inspired. That's why they called themselves phalange.
Ah.
They were inspired by Franco. So then now we can see the connection.
They actually went to Spain. Pierre Jamal,
Yeah.
he went to Spain, and from there he came back to Lebanon and formed what he called the Phalanges.
Who is the father? Was the father of Bashir Gemayel, who was assassinated by a bombing, upon which pretext the Phalange and the other right-wing forces in Lebanon, the Lebanese forces, went and massacred the Palestinians in the camp.
So this is how you can connect Spanish Civil War to the Lebanese.
Yeah, this is one of the connections. But there is more.
Yeah.
Wait, let's yeah.
So I don't want to enter in all the details. Like all of these things would be a seminar of their own, right? But the Civil War.
That maybe you'll design in the future. And
Yeah, that's right. So the Falangistas were fighting the Republicans. The Republicans was this coalition with the communists, the socialists, the anarchists, the bourgeois liberals, the radicals, everybody who wanted to have a democratic republic. And the fascists or the Falangistas had the explicit support of Hitler and of Mussolini. And I say support because they sent the aviation and bombed the hell Barcelona, the one by Guernica, you know this famous painting by Picasso?
Yeah.
Guernica is a town in the Basque Country that got so bombed.
Maybe we can find the picture because I was
Yeah.
actually I was designing a flyer for the event and I did all the design and so on. And then my computer crashed and I had the image
Yeah.
of Picasso's Guernica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Guernica is a symbol of this kind of the aviation raids of the two fascist countries that sided. And you know, I don't want to enter into the polemics, but I would say that the side that was rooting for the Republicans got really frustrated with the French and with the Soviet Union, which kind of have supported, not really supported their side. So, you know, like they were saying this is not fair because they're getting the support. I mean, the German military was sick, right? Like, and then it's like, what do we get? The French say, well, we don't want to get too much in trouble because if we get involved in the war, we're going to have the war in ourselves. So the only thing the French did is to open the borders to let the political refugees in. So that's why you find so many refugees and immigration in France. But they didn't really give military support to the. And you know, the Soviet Union sent some tanks and things, but you know, like it was not like a full.
Because it wasn't also a pure for them, and
Yeah.
the view was not the
So-
pure.
So there was this kind of, it didn't become just a national civil war. It has a national civil war, but one side was getting significant support from very militarized societies, and the other side was not. And so the Republicans lost.
What about Mexico involved with?
Mexico was welcomed when the war began, the government of the republic went into exile as a government to Mexico.
Oh,
So Mexico kind of hosted, so like, you know, was a symbolic thing. The government was conducting the war from Mexico in exile. So they welcomed most of the Republicans. So it was a lot of, the two countries people went to were France and Mexico, right? If you want to choose a country to be a political exile at the time. But it was harder to get to Mexico because it was more like the elite who could get there. The people who were poor, they pack their bags and just take the road and cross the border and just pray they're gonna make it to France before they get caught. That's when then once you're in France, you figure out what to do, you know? Maybe you're gonna move up, you're gonna go to another, but it was like, you know, what we're seeing now with the refugees, you know? In Syria was not right. And then if you look at the war pictures of Robert Capa and all of these American photographers, you will see all these pictures of all the people, like the refugees living through the roads, right? Living So the war was atrocious, like all wars. And then what followed is more atrocious. People think that most of the violence occurred during the war, but actually most of the violence occurred after the war, because there was a lot of political repression. And that's a topic that it's not, I mean, now it's being spoken about, but when I was in school, we barely talked about this. I mean, they say, well, there was a war, and both sides did wrong things. I say, well, okay, but there was a right side.
Just there were good people on both
Everybody
sides.
killed people, and it was difficult, and we're not going to talk about it. Well, okay, but, you know, like, there were significant sizes of losses in one side versus the other. Basically, way more Republicans got killed on Falangistas. And when Franco won and established this dictatorship, he carried from 39 to almost like 1950, a systematic political repression town by town. So they will go town by town and say everybody who supported them, clean up. And there was also guerrilla warfare going on that people don't talk about. There was guerrilla warfare going on in the country. So it was not just the violence.
Can you say something about Garcia Lorca?
Oh yeah, so Garcia Lorca was this poet who was killed by the Guardia Civiles in Granada. Was one of the most important poets in Spain, the avant-garde.
And playwright too.
And playwriter. And then he was an active supporter of the Second Republic. He also went touring the countryside with his plays. He had this kind of troupe of popular theater. And he was part of this, you know, what opened up in the 30s was a big intellectual revolution where, for example, there were like new pedagogical experiments happening of education, rural education in the countryside, where people were thinking we need a different model that is not the Catholic Church, which is repetition and memorization, and it's like these topics, who cares about? We need to learn from experience, we need to take the kids to nature so they can learn we need to build social relations between people. So there was like this huge progressive anarchists were booming, whether like Ateneos Populares, they were doing all these like universities for workers after they left work. They could go and learn about art, about sexual education, right? About like all of this was happening. And then boom, the civil war came and the dictatorship came, and it was silence, radio silence. You cannot talk about these things. You're terrified because everybody is asking, where was your father this day? What were you doing in the 30s? What was your aunt doing in the 30s? What was your grandfather? So there's a lot of summary executions happening. And so you have like people are saying, okay, now we shut up. And so during the whole period of dictatorship, who was for 39 to 78, when basically the guy dies, Franco, it's not like, he dies, the question of the Catalan people became, again, the Catalans became again an oppressed nationality, where the language, maybe you could use it at home, but you cannot use it at school. You cannot forget about having your own government, your own elections, your own institution. Like, you are suppressed. Especially at a moment where, from the early 20th century to 36, the Catalan culture was booming, right? So in 1911, from 1910 to 30, in 1911 is when we create the government, the Catalans create the Institut d'Estudis Catalans, the Institute of Catalan Studies. So there is a publication of the first Catalan grammar. This is how to write Catalan. The publication of the big names of literature, poetry. So like, they were like saying, wow, we have finally, it's our time in history, this is our culture, this is our language, this is our music. And then they get slammed. And then they say, all of these out of the picture. What we're going to teach in school is a real Spanish history from Castilla, all of that. So during this period of dictatorship, you have a new form of oppression, of cultural and political oppression of the Catalan people that is endured for 30 years. And I said there are contradictions in this process because still, Catalonia is developing economically very much. And a lot of the development in Catalonia throughout the 20th century, so like, okay, there is no development until, let's talk about the 60s. Okay, between 39 and 60s, Spain is dirt poor. People are starving. People don't have anything to eat. People are crossing the border to go to Portugal to get a loaf of bread. That's what my great-grandmother did, right? Like, they are dying of hunger. Like, there's nothing developed, right? But, the United States starts fostering some economic development in Spain. They say, it's true they have a dictatorship, but we want to do business with them, so they welcome Spain into the UN despite of the dictatorship. And they start like investing in Spain. And so there's some economic development happening from the 60s to the 70s, and a lot of the development that is happening in Catalonia is because the workforce that works there are the people from the south of Spain that go to work in the metropolitan area, right? So most of my classmates, their parents were poor people from Andalusia, from Extremadura, who after the Civil War, there was no industry, nothing left, and they had to immigrate. So there was two big waves of immigration. People who went to France, right, and to England and to Germany, exterior immigration, and also internal immigration in the country. To the regions that are economically dynamic. So we arrive in 78 in a situation where Catalans are oppressed and politically and culturally, where they're doing a little bit better economically thanks to the labor of other people who are overexploited. Because, class and race and gender, all these things intersect. You cannot think of history separated. And when the dictatorship ends, and this is very important to understand the recent history, there is a new constitution that is drafted by all the parties to say, okay, we need a democratic constitution. And the constitution had to deal with the historic problem of Catalans. And so it finds a compromise, which is a compromise, like all compromisers, they're only going to cover up the problems, they're not going to solve it. They say, Spain is a nation of nationalities. Understand what you want. Article 1 of the Constitution. And the Catalans say, well, we are a nation. No, you're a nationality. Okay, but, so like, they're not saying you don't exist, but they kind of create two things. A nation
You're subsumed.
Of nationalities.
That's the nation.
It's not a nation it's a nation of nationalities. And so, they said, okay, let's live with this compromise for now, because we don't want another war. So they accept it's a nation of nationalities. And so there is this constitution. Oh, this is come in handy. So you have the Constitution.
My friends are gonna.
Oh. Yeah, thank you.
I used to have, but since I don't do anything on the board.
Well, this is no better, pero this is a state. Huh? Money for some things and for other things.
They have some magic like,
Yeah, do that?
thank you.
Throw them away, they don't work.
This one works.
It doesn't work, just throw it away.
Okay, so you have two documents that are drafted. The Constitution. So this is 1978, very important year. Apparently, this was the year where everything got solved. The Constitution that says Spain is a nation of nationalities, which seems that everybody is happy, but everybody leaves the meeting with a different understanding of what was signed. The Catalans say, we got it, we're a nationality in the nation, we're something like nation. And the others say, we just got out of it because they're just a nationality. And then there is what we call Estatuto de Autonomía, which is two different addendums, like you have here the Constitution and you have the amendments to the Constitution, right? Thank you. So there was this Constitution and there were two amendments to the Constitution, which were two special recognition of special statuses for two regions in Spain. One for Catalonia.
This is all in 1978.
Yeah.
And this is where
78,
the nation of
78.
is this
79.
when the nations and nationalities?
Yes.
was up?
Here. So one for Catalonia and one for País Vasco, Basque Country. So each one negotiates their own. So they say, okay, so this Estatuto de Autonomía is going to explain what kind of national rights these two peoples are going to have inside of this. And so basically what they say is that over the past of the years, like we begin in 79, in the future, the central government is going to start transferring rights it has slowly back to the two nations, oppressed nationalities. Mainly, it has to do with the management of education, who's going to be in charge of setting an education system, who's going to finance it, healthcare, and things like that. And so the two things that got negotiated, it was like, it was an agreement for the next 20, 30 years. One is what we call competencias, these kind of state attributions. And the other one is the tax system, money. Who pays money and who gets what? Because Catalans and Basque Country were making more money, so they say, well, we want this money to be invested here. So the idea was that with this agreement, this historic problem would be solved, or it could be renegotiated. Okay. The competencies began to be transferred. Mainly was education, healthcare and other social services, and even the police. Okay. So the Catalans now have their own police force, starting in the 90s. So they start taking over some of the state attributes that they span, right, in the region. And they have, of course, their own parliament, right? So we have our Generalitat, we have our own elections of our own government. And then the tax system, this was the same for the Basques and for the Catalans. But for the tax system, the Basques got a better deal. Because during the dictatorship, the resistance in the Basque, the liberation movement, nationalist movement in the Basque Country was more forceful, meaning it had a military arm, which was called the ETA. And people think, oh, ETA is a terrorist band. Yes, it is a terrorist group, but it was the military branch of a political organization that was fighting for the self-determination of the Basque people.
Like the IRA and the
Like the
PLO
IRA.
and the ANC and
Exactly.
the RFMLN.
So so they had more bargaining power, because what the government didn't want is for the Basque to start again rioting in the streets. And so the Basque said, this is how we're gonna collect taxes. We collect the taxes, and we give you what you need to, what the rule says. We don't dispute how much, but we collect the taxes, and we give you what is yours, we keep the rest. The Catalans got a different deal. Madrid collects the taxes and gives to the Catalans what is
that's
theirs.
like Oslo.
Yeah. Madrid collects the taxes, so everybody's paying the same amount. There's no difference in the rates we're paying, right? Because people are paying in function of how much they make, the regions, and they receive of how many people they have. But what changed is a detail, but it's a very important detail, right? Like I said, like it's not the same thing I collect and I give you that they collect and they give me, but this is not what we agree upon. Okay, follow the agreements, you know. So they agree with this deal. And so what happens? What happens is that over the course of since the 80s and 90s, these things start going well. But a lot of Catalans are unhappy about the tax system. And we can debate this, because there is a question of solidarity of people who can make more money with people who make less. So the Catalans say we're one of the third richest nations, California, right? Why do we need to subsidize public hospitals in Tennessee? Imagine, right? Like, why, if we're making a lot of money, why, if there are people hungry here, why we need to pay taxes? That's a discourse that starts happening
Or
in Catalonia.
that when people say that here in that, why are the rich suburbs are paying taxes to subsidize schools in the poor areas?
Yes. So there's a little bit of this discourse that starts happening, and you would say, well, I don't know if I'm going to be behind that because there's a solidarity needed, and your wealth was built with all the workers that came from these underdeveloped regions, so it's normal. But at the same time, this is why I think it's complicated, Catalans have a point in the sense that everything that is built in Catalonia, every public infrastructure, who pays? The Catalan government. Like highways, you have to pay, ¿cómo se dice? Peaje, you need to tolls, because they're investment with private companies. Highways in the rest of Spain, free. Spanish state and European Union pay. Highways in the Basque Country, pay. Subway system in Barcelona, who pays the subway system? Catalan government. Subway system in Madrid, who pays the subway system? The Spanish state, meaning Catalans, Basques, everybody. So there's a moment where there is a discrimination in investment in, so
disparity.
A disparity. So there is the question of the tax system is also the question of economic sovereignty. Okay, so it's complicated. You see, it's not black and white. It's complicated because there's many arguments made. There is a real disparate investment of the state in Catalonia, because they say, because you're the rich, you'll pay for it. We're going to use the tax money to invest. But there's a moment where Catalans were saying, but if we're paying taxes, why our subway is not paid with our state taxes, federal taxes? Why our subway needs to be paid by a regional tax? So it becomes this growing frustration. And so the Spanish state say, I understand you're frustrated. Let's discuss. This is a document that is very old. Let's come together and draft a new Estatuto de Autonomía. And the Catalans say, okay, we will draft a new Estatuto de Autonomía. And they go through meetings and meetings and meetings and drafting and redrafting, and everybody's bored to death. Why are we talking about the Estatuto? I'm fine. And they come to an agreement of a new Estatuto de Autonomía in 2006 that is voted in the Catalan parliament. And it's voted with 2/3 of the votes of the different political parties. I think it was there's 135 seats in the Catalan parliament, and this got minimum 120 of approval. So do you imagine the kind of process? Like I say that because I'm in so many university committees, and it's like so lengthy, and you waste your time, and you're going to go work. So imagine the kind of labor and conciliation that went into agreeing, this is what we need. This is the new competencies we want. This is the new tax system we want. They come and they vote in their own parliament. And the central government from Madrid, who at the time had this from the Socialist Party president, José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, said, I will approve, this is the sentence that killed him, I will approve the Estatuto that will be voted in the Catalan parliament. Like, whatever you guys decide, I will fight for it. Okay, so the Catalans bring their things, and they bring it, then it needs to be voted in the Spanish parliament, right? Las Cortes Generales. And then there is a second political party, the Partido Popular, who blocks.
This is the more right-wing party.
The more right-wing party, which the former president was Mariano Rajoy.
Mhm.
So when the vote happens in Madrid, the Partido Popular, which is the second party, does not show up to vote.
Oh, boycotts.
Boycott.
Boycotts elections.
Boycotts the parliamentary procedure. So it gets
Oh,
approved.
the parliament
The
itself.
procedures, yeah, it's kind of like, it's imagine as if, no, I will be dreaming, imagine as if the Democratic senators didn't show up to vote for Kavanaugh.
Or this is
Right?
right?
It could-
filibuster or
Yeah,
something
it's,
like
it
this.
like it will still pass, but what is the meaning of passing if the other party that needs to kind of agree that this is is absent? So everybody's saying, okay, so this is kind of devaluing the fact that they don't come to vote, is devaluing the legitimacy of this new document.
So they didn't have two-thirds quorum. They had two-thirds quorum.
And
that
here they
document?
had 2/3, it
Yeah.
passed.
Right.
And here it passed, but without this party boycotting.
So in 2006 and.
There were
okay.
two votes. This is the
Right.
vote in the Catalan parliament,
Okay,
and our Catalan parliament was 2/3.
okay.
And in here in Madrid, it was
Oh,
simple
this is
majority.
in the central government. What
Yeah.
about the Basque?
There was no negotiation of the Basque. This is
Okay.
only about the Catalan.
Okay.
The Basque were just looking.
Mhm.
Let's see what the Catalans do.
Mhm.
They're smarter, and let's see. And they will learn from the process, and we figure it out. So they said, okay, the Catalans want to play it nice. They did all the homework. They presented this huge estatuto, huge. It passes in the thing. Here these guys don't show up, and they start saying, the Partido Popular, that the estatuto is unconstitutional. And they start like doing a lot of legal recourses. So the Partido Popular files up to 7, how do you say it? Recurso legal, I don't say how appeals,
Objections. Objections? Or
objections, yeah,
Legal briefs.
yeah,
Legal briefs? Okay.
to the Tribunal Supremo, to the Supreme Court, let's put it this way. So, and why they say it's unconstitutional? I guess they article by article 7 times, because the preamble of the new Estatuto says that Catalonia is a nation. And they say, no, because Catalonia is a nationality. There is only one nation, that is Spain. So all of this matters document is unconstitutional
Because of that
because it
definition.
says since the beginning that Catalonia is a nation, and we had agreed in '79 that Catalonia is a nationality, not a nation. There's only one nation, the nation is Spain. Let's not. So they say, and then what happened? This is the tragic thing, that in 2010, the Supreme Court says, yes, the Partido Popular is right. This whole thing is unconstitutional.
Who appoints the Supreme Court?
The government.
And who in the government?
I think,
How's the process? Is it like
I
the
think-
US?
I think, yeah, they need to be voted by the Congress. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
But so then, by this time, Catalans are just like furious. They said like, God, so we went through all of this. We did all the, we had agreement with all the parties here, which was impossible. We do it well. You appeal, nothing has been implemented because of this legal procedure. And totally is unconstitutional because of the preamble and this and that. So people get furious in Catalonia. And it's not, they were not, actually Catalan people, they were not very invested in all of this bureaucratic thing, like the everyday person. But when this happened, they said, what's up? Like, why are you saying no?
Why are you so objective?
Why object?
Like, why won't you restore the AMED law?
Yeah. Like, why, why? And so, like, Catalans say, okay, so they just, the nationalism starts developing very fast. Because this is a right-wing government, it's an economic crisis, right? Cuts are happening, people are, like, losing their houses, losing their jobs, and then on top of it, like, they feel like they're thrown back to the past because they thought they were winning more and more rights because you're in a democratic country, and then they're told, you slap on your face, I don't care what you did in your parliament, has no value for me. Because you see, it's a dispute of sovereignty, right? The Catalan parliament approved it, and the Spanish tribunal is saying what you approved is unconstitutional. So the Catalans say, okay, so what the 2/3 of the elected representatives of Catalonia think is unconstitutional, and what is what we want? Is what we want, is what our elected people have done. So then the nationalist parties start growing in membership, very much. Yeah.
Where, in Spain or in
Catalonia.
Okay.
Catalonia. The nationalist parties say like, And so they decide to run for elections united. They form a united front of the nationalist parties. And this front they win the 2015 elections, this coalition. And the coalition is called Junts per Sí, together for the yes, because they say, if you vote for us, we will organize a referendum of the Catalan people on this document. We organize a referendum on our own rights, because it's unacceptable what has happened.
We will run how we would decide.
Yeah,
how
we will run, like, we want to restore our sovereignty. Our sovereignty has been violated by this whole process. If you vote for us, we want to poll the Catalan people about what is their feeling about self-determination, because we tried to go through the legal route, and it's a waste of time, and we got mistreated. And there is no room in the legal right, because they already told us that we cannot be a nation. So we want to ask the Catalan people if they want to be a nation. So they were very clear. And they won the elections, okay?
By a landslide, right?
By a landslide. I mean, as a coalition, they got around, I think, 70% of the seats. So then, but then they start sweating. They say, okay, we ran and we're saying that we're going to defy the Spanish state. So they need to start, and so they said, so they debate. I mean, I'm going to just, the Catalan melodrama, I'm just going to skip it. But they come to one agreement. They say, okay, in 2 years, because that was September, we're going to organize a referendum to see if people want to remain in Spain or if they want an independent country. Because we're being told that there is no room for us in the Spanish constitution. We're being asked to amend the constitution. No. We ask a new statuto. No. So people need to decide here, because we have this decision, and this decision doesn't fit here. So people need to decide, do you want to remain in Spain? And so we remain with the deal we had in '79, because we cannot get anything else, or we want to secede and develop our own state.
Which Britain did when exited the European Union, and nobody was up in arms about it.
Yeah. And so and they're very clear, and so Madrid is thinking, these guys are not going to do it, it's crazy, how to organize a referendum to secede, like, doesn't fit in their head. And so they organize it, and it's what happened last year, right? When there was the referendum of October 1st, 2017. And so this referendum was organized in a kind of clandestine way. Because, thank you.
Yeah.
Technology. Yeah. So the referendum happens, and it happens with a lot of conflict, because the Spanish government starts freaking out and starts policing everybody in the Catalan government. It's as if the FBI and the CIA were spying on the California legislature, which is organizing, and the California legislature were hiding ballots for the elections in the houses of neighbors, and maybe passing them through Mexico, right? Like, that's the level of insanity, right? So the Catalan government goes almost like, I would say, they're professional politicians. They're not like these people who got elected. They go almost like underground to prepare a referendum to escape the surveillance of the Spanish state. And the Spanish state goes crazy.
The Kurdish population in Turkey.
And the Spanish state was crazy and searches the house of this minister of Catalonia, and searches the house of this other, and searches this and searches that. They cannot find the ballot boxes, and the election day is coming, and they're getting really nervous, and they don't know. And then they say, your election is not going to work because you don't have the list of the list of the voters.
Registered voters.
Yeah, and say, well, we have a system. How? You're violating the Privacy Act. So they were trying by all means to delegitimize and say, well, nobody's going to come to vote for your thing. Nobody's going to come to vote. I mean, and usually, like in Spain, like here, already you have 50% of the population who comes to vote is a miracle, right? Nobody's going to come to vote. The Catalans continue organizing clandestinely, and the day of, nobody knows, are there going to be ballot boxes? Are people going to show up? People are organizing the schools, like this kind of popular organization. The teachers' unions say, we're going to vote in the schools, it's very system, we're going to organize picket lines, and everybody will be able to vote. And so, like the police, the Spanish police is saying, we need now to go into the schools to beat up people, to steal ballot boxes, which is what happened on October 1st. So what happened on October 1st is precisely that. The police, the national police, is mobilized to get rid of as many ballot boxes as they can, but they can't get rid of all the ballot boxes, and they have to beat up a lot of people, and like 900 people are injured, filed police complaints, and there's like a lot of trials happening, end up in the hospital. You have these videos of like the Spanish police beating down like grandmas and grandpas who are like it's this kind of like insane use of brutal force to prevent a vote. Okay, so that is like the last straw. Like Catalans, like people, you nationalists, not nationalists, you say like this makes no sense, you know, that why first Catalan people cannot vote is asking a question. Okay, is asking a question. And two, if you don't agree with it, you cannot just send the police to beat up people who want to vote. You need to find another way to delegitimize this thing, but you cannot just go do that, because like you're acting like a dictatorship. Like you see the image and people say, and I cannot believe this is happening under democracy. Like the government sending the police to beat up people who want to vote. Like, and it's what happened. And previously, you know, on September of 2000, so before the vote, because there was this escalation of the national, you know, between 2015 and 2017, there's big historic demonstrations of the nationalists in the street. On September 11th, the day of Nationality of Catalonia, have millions of people in the streets. So there's a lot of popular mobilization. And in September, there's a crazy thing that happened, is that the Guardia Civil, which is a military police from the dictatorship, enters in the Ministerio de Economía, the economic department of the Catalan government, which is in the center of Barcelona. They enter the police because they say, the ballot boxes are there, the ballots are there. So the police raids this. And the people living in Barcelona, they say, we saw the police enter the Department of Economy of the Catalan government in downtown Barcelona. And in, like, with Facebook and Twitter and all that, like, in an hour, you have 30,000 people surrounding the building. But the Guardia Civil was inside, and the Guardia Civil was terrified to exit because they think these people are gonna beat us up, right? And so the Guardia Civil needs to call the Catalan police and say, please, will you escort us out of the building because people are gonna kill us, you know? So the Catalan police goes there, tells people, okay, calm down, don't escorts the other police out, right? And I say this because this incident happens, which is kind of like the Spanish government freaking out. October 1st happens, and October 1st, the votes go as follows. So you will see the results. I'm almost done, then we can discuss and take questions. I'm sorry I'm speaking so much. So you have 5.3 million people who are eligible to vote. That's if 100% of people go to vote. And in the referendum, you have 2.2 million who voted. So it's around 40%, 43%. Like, okay, so 2.2 million went to vote in a hostile environment when you found the day before where we had to go and vote, was a, you know, like you didn't know what was going on. So 2.2 million went to vote, and of these 2.2 million, 2 million, which is 92%, said, yes, we want to be independent. So of course the Spanish government says, well, this is a real vote, only 43% people went to vote, and there was no real ballot boxes, and there was, but you know, actually
Technicalities.
yeah, but this is an actual average turnout for an election, and if you didn't have all this repression, you would have 60 or 70 people vote. And of everybody who showed up to vote, you have 2 million that say they want to secede from you, that they want you at least to listen to what they have to say. So you would say, okay, so after this, the Spanish government needs to say, okay, you know, there's 2 million people who risked everything to go and vote, who risked being beat up by the police, being arrested, who went and vote. We need to talk to them. What does the Spanish government do? Use the constitution to suppress any national rights. Because the constitution has an article, which is the Article 155, kind of like a state of exception, like if you're in a war or something. 155 that suspends the rights of the Estatuto de Autonomía. So the government says, you know what? You want to play tough? I'm going to play tough. I dissolve the Catalan government. We appoint a Catalan government. They did that. They appointed a Catalan government. We dissolve all of your people. We put our police in the streets. And we're going to put in jail everybody responsible for that nonsense. So they put in jail the elected members of the Catalan government. So you have the vice president is in jail still today. The president Puigdemont is in exile.
Somebody went to the president went to France, right?
Yeah,
So,
he's in Belgium.
yeah.
So the president had to go in exile in Belgium. The vice president, who's the leader of the second party in Catalonia, is still in jail. 5 other ministers of the government who were supposedly responsible for organizing the vote, because the investigation said, you were the one in charge of setting the role of elected people. You were the one in charge of finding the ballot. So all of these people, they just go, arrest them in their house, put them in jail without a trial. They're still in jail since October 2017, these people are in jail without a trial. Okay? They put them in jail, and this is why I speak about the demonstration of September. They also put in jail the leaders of the 2 civil organizations who organized the demonstrations. Right? Because these demonstrations from the Catalan Day of Independence, these organizations are 2 organizations, the ANC, Asamblea Nacional de Catalunya, which is like, so this is a non-political party, it's a social organization of Catalans. And the other one is Òmnium Cultural, which is an organization that promotes Catalan culture. And they're the ones who've been holding all the demonstrations. So the president of ANC and the president of Òmnium Cultural, because they're called through Facebook and Twitter to come to the demonstration in September, and because they spoke in front of the crowd, they didn't say to use violence or anything. They spoke and they said they think it's intolerable, that the Guardia Civil is entering the premises of the Catalan government without authorization, that this is a violation of Catalan rights. Because they spoke, they're accusing them of sedition, which is something that was only used under the monarchy of the Borbones. That's kind of like a same word used in the 18th century against you betrayed us. You did the war with the other. You're rioting. You want to overthrow the government. So the president of ANC, who had hundreds of thousands of members, and the president of Òmnium Cultural, because they mobilized for the demonstration, they also were arrested, pending trial, and they're still in jail. So what the government did is, 1, they put a lot of people in jail, political repression. 2, they dissolved the Catalan government. 3, they called snap elections in December. They said, we're going to repress them, and we're going to do elections in Catalonia, and we're going to win. They do elections, and the Catalan people vote the same thing they voted in like, this time the parties don't go together, they go separate, okay? For example, the 2 big parties is PDeCAT and Esquerra Republicana. And they still get a majority. They have 3 parties, Partido de Catalunya, Esquerra. This is more national bourgeoisie conservative. This is middle class left Republicans. And CUP, which is a new party, which is left anti-capitalist, pro-national self-determination. So they're nationalists and they're anti-capitalist. And these ones get 10 seats. This didn't exist before. So they win. They do the elections in 2017 in December, after all of this craziness, and they still win the majority of the government. But they have a lot of their former government in jail. Right. So I just wanted to give this story. I know I spoke a lot, but I think it's important to understand that what happened in 2017 or even since 2006 is a kind of acceleration of dynamics that are like embedded in Spanish history since the constitution of the Spanish state in the 16th century and since the dictatorship. And this is very polarizing in Catalonia today. Very polarizing. The society is really very divided. But there is one thing where people are not divided. They believe that repression is wrong, so everybody's furious at the repression. The Partido Popular, which is the one of the government that did that, has less than 10% of the vote in Catalonia. They cannot even show their face around because people will spit at them because they send the police to beat up people. So there is a big understanding that was absolutely crazy to refuse to negotiate with the Catalans and just repress them and put them in jail. Everybody disagrees that these people should be in jail. They think there is no charges against them, there is no trial, this is just political repression. And the second thing people agree on is that it would be good to vote. Even so, there's a lot of people who are against independence who think we should be able to vote. I support the right of self-determination, but most of the people in my family don't. They want to remain in Spain, but they think, why is it so hard to have a referendum to vote? Let's have a public debate and vote. You know, let's decide, do we want to be in a federal republic? Do we want to be a separate state? Do we want to stay as we is? Why we don't talk about these things? Why people freak out, you know? So this is still ongoing because the president, so there were new elections, you know, but the former president, Puigdemont, is still in exile, and the political prisoners are still in jail. The only thing that has changed is that the government that applied the 155 is not in power anymore. Because in March of this year, it got kicked out. So there's a different government. And this government was elected, Pedro Sánchez, the president of the Socialist Party, and was elected with the understanding that he will negotiate with Catalan. So now we don't know what this negotiation is going to be, because the Catalans say, we still want to do a referendum. Because you beat us up, we want to do a referendum, and the socialists say, I don't know if we can do that because it's going to raise a lot of tension. And so we're still waiting to see what's going to happen. But this could happen again, you know, because the people have not fundamentally, like, people did not back down after the repression. It's not that the government repressed and people say, okay, forget about it, I don't care anymore. Yeah. Like, the repressed and they say, no, actually we were agreeing with that and we wanted it again, you know. So maybe now we can have a conversation.
Okay, so let's have a discussion before we move to the parallel history of Palestine, which is not necessarily exactly parallel, because things are not always lining up nicely. Questions, discussion, to Professor Nisa. Can you just find the picture of Guernica, the Picasso, so we can just show it so the students? Yeah. So any discussion, question? I have questions for you if you don't. Okay. So, no, I actually, part of the reason I thought about it was because of the anniversary of the referendum.
Yeah.
And I thought, like, people in the US don't talk about this, and our students don't get a chance to hear about these things. And a lot of this time is put in European history. So people only think about, European history, and then they skip a lot of these tosses and turns and the ways in which things are not necessarily lining up the way they would like to talk about them and the whole history of the European nation state. So one of the discussions today even is the question of, Fortress Europe. How is what's happening to the immigrants? How are the immigrants affecting or not affecting? And even the beginning of the discussion doesn't begin from the people who are not all actually immigrants, if you think about Spain or France or Italy or anywhere else. People who've actually been living there for thousands and thousands of years, and assuming the people are like France or Spain, whatever, are pure. Okay, this is Guernica. This is the painting Picasso did in order to depict the horrors of Guernica. And the painting is in the United Nations, right? Isn't it in the United Nations?
No, I think it's
replica.
Sofia. Is it Reina Sofia? No.
Reina Sofia and go back to here. And what he did, okay, I'll talk about this and go back. Let me finish. Yeah, so there's this whole discussion that as if there is something called pure Spanish, pure French, pure. So this is kind of like one thing that I think it's the ways you talk about it is very, very, very interesting, very exciting, very dynamic history that we want to talk about. That when we talk about the histories of communities of color or indigenous communities, we talk about that. But when it comes to kind of like learning about Europe, sort of it becomes off what do you call it?
Off limits.
What is it?
Off limits?
Of limits, yeah, of limits, and the discussion becomes about are there too many immigrants? Are there enough immigrants? What's happening with host countries? Are the countries trying to change the immigrants into their culture or whatever? And then it all becomes about the policies of the governments rather than actually what's happening with the people and so on. And also it eliminates all the oppositional movements that exist in the various countries. So then the discussion becomes about France. Is France going to continue being French? Nobody asks, what the hell is French? What does French mean? What does Spanish mean? And I'm saying this because I know this is your area.
Yeah.
Okay, French. And so I think this is, and so that's one of the things. The other question I was thinking about, so I think it's really important to be able to think about all histories as very dynamic histories, as histories that happen in the past, but they're also happening in the present. And they're in the making, and they point to our future. So what does, I mean, one of the questions, like, what does this mean then for where we're going, and what does this mean for the work we're doing? The other thing, the reason I also thought about this is because I was reading a lot about the exhuming of the Franco's remains. And so Franco is buried in this big church, Catholic church, and so on. And then there's all these people who are going there from the Phalange and the fascists and saluting him. And they have, the Hitler salute. And it's quite, I don't want to even raise my hand because some Zionist is going to take that picture and show me as if I'm actually doing it or something. I can't even portray that. So, but I thought that was actually quite interesting because now it's also reliving and remembering what happens. And there is, I mean, in Spain, you talked about it. There is, at the very least, two big amnesias. One is about Andalusia. And when you go to Andalusia, and we were there in the summer in a conference, and one of the governments in Andalusia talks about how the Catholic rule was the rule of tolerance, and we're all looking at each other. And this is the World Congress of Middle East Studies, right? So this, all he says this, and did he really say that? We actually thought maybe we didn't hear what he said. And it's like, where do you live? I mean, like, look around you, and we're in this big place called Alcazar, which means Alcosar, the palace, which is the Andalusian palace. And so there is this whole, and there is also the amnesia about the Spanish Civil War and fascism and so on. Part of it because people don't want to remember, part of it is quite painful, and part of it because it's been suppressed. So I thought about kind of like if you can also talk about this a little bit. And then I wanted to share some of the stuff being in the Basque and Andalusia. So, but yeah.
So the question of national identities in Europe, is a big debate. There, I mean, it's the question of what is to be French versus to be Spanish, But there's also, for example, the Catalan movement is people are saying there's a rise of nationalism in Europe,
Catalonia,
and so they compare the rise of racist, proto-fascist nationalism going on in Germany, with the rise of the nationalist, racist Front National, with the rise of Catalonia. They say everything is nationalism. And say, well, no, look, I'm not a nationalist, I'm a socialist, I'm an internationalist. But in internationalists, you have nations. So the idea is that nations, people who should have the right to identify as nations and should have the right of self-determination and a right of relate to other nations as they wish to, and based on their freedom. So there is not the same an oppressed nation in a state that a nation state that is oppressing other nations. And so there is this false equation that the rise of nationalisms is hiding many times the struggles for national recognition, which are struggles for political self-emancipation, political equality. So that's one way the Spanish government has tried to merge and say like, oh, Europe is in danger because Europe was constructed to in order to ensure that we'll have no more wars and we'll have peace. Well, that's not the reason Europe was created. I mean, you know that Europe was initially an agreement between Germany and France, who were destroyed by the war, to produce coal and iron and steel together. So it was an industrial agreement to rebuild the bourgeoisies of two of the old empires. And it was an economic agreement. And so the rest is just rhetoric to cover up the fact that Europe had to unite or create an economic unity and a common market if it wanted to compete with the United States in the post-war period. Then they added a beautiful rhetoric of human rights, etc. But, you know, like it's the same Europe that is glossed over as being that you know, France and Algeria, torture in Algeria was part of Europe. And I can go on and on about the crimes Europe continues to do. So there's one way this is framed in the mass media is like Europe versus nationalism, and that's wrong. There is, as you say, there is an increase of right-wing nationalisms, and it is very, very, it's growing very fast. The other day I was watching French TV. I try not to watch too much TV because it takes the hope and the soul away from me, but sometimes
Yeah,
I do.
really.
And American TV is just like the last thing I could do. I mean, like I watched like for the Catalan thing and it took me a whole week to recover. But the French TV, I just thought it was not so bad, and there is this right-wing commentator, Eric Zemmour, which I hate with all my guts. He's very racist. And he's the one who's kind of the intellectual who gives a theory to the Front National, which is a right-wing party. So his former theory is the theory of replacement. He's saying that real French people are being replaced by Arabs and Muslims. So he says there is a big replacement of population, and the original French, les Français de souche, are being replaced by, they're not being French, right? They're being replaced.
Right.
Which is like kind of
Which
like...
is also Italy, by the way,
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
discourse.
So I was used to that, and people were saying, well, maybe this is a fascist thing. We should debate. I said, okay. But the other day I was watching TV, and he interrupted a TV presentator who's black, who's from Senegal, and her name is Absatou. And he said, well, for example, you, Absatou, you should have a French name. And I said, what do you mean a French name? So, well, you should be called something else. And she says, what should I be called? Corinne. You should be called Corinne, a real French name. This is on prime time national TV, okay? And then they cut it, because they cut it, what I'm going to tell, cut it. Because in France, you cannot have openly racist statements in the TV.
You can have coached implicit racism.
Yeah, but it's different. It's different than here, because free speech, you cannot say openly offensive things. It's considered a limit to free speech in the law. So the French, they had to edit the portion, because what he said was, so he said, your name is a shame for France. You're dishonoring France by carrying this name, and your parents should have given you a real French name. And she replied to him, you are dishonoring France, right? You're the one. But the whole debate, I say this because the whole debate is he's saying, well, in France, we usually only could give French names to people. And by French, he said names that are in the Christian calendar. And that was a law that instituted by Napoleon, and that was in place until 1990s. That you go to your kid is born, and you say, this is the name of my kid, and you need to have a real French name, a Christian name. And there were some exceptions for some foreign names, mainly like if you want to call like Ivan or Alexander from Russia, it's okay, but not to call your kid Mohammed or Malik or no, that was not the idea, understand it? But so the idea that the debate we're having today is that if you don't have a Christian name, is a clear sign that your parents and you do not want to be part of France. And I say this is, okay, the rhetoric is the same, but the fact that we're discussing at the level of name, it's very dangerous, because it's in the skin, right? It's like the way you're named is an insult to me. You're not French because you're named. So this is happening very strongly, and in Spain the debates are different, but the proto-Falangista movement, there's also an increase, with the rise of Catalan nationalism, there's been a rise of Spanish nationalism, or the flags. When Franco died, they changed the flag, so the colors are the same, but there is a different symbol in the middle. And during Franco, there was a black eagle, which is the eagle of the Phalanges. And so we call that pre-constitutional flags, Falangista flags. And so now in a lot of the demonstrations of the people against Catalonia, because they're demonstrations of people from Spain, you've seen the pre-constitutional flags being waved by young people without any, and people just openly say, I think we need a return of order. And it's not just happening in Europe, because in Brazil, the elections of Bolsonaro, right, the right-wing guy who got 46% of the vote this Sunday, is also very worrisome.
And I think about Franco.
Yeah.
The exhumation of his.
The exhumation of, it's kind of like, like the Valle de los Caídos is this monument where you have two kinds of remains. You have the remains of Franco and the remains of the dictator that was before him, Primo de Rivera. And then you have, which are in the center, like underneath the crypta where God is. And on the two sides you have fosas comunes, or a lot of bones on unidentified people, thousands and thousands of, because the monument was built by political prisoners. And many died building it and were buried there. So it's kind of like some kind of the slaves who built the pyramids. So this is opening a lot of wounds. The big problem is not just the symbol problem. The big problem is the real acknowledgement of history. I mean, it's still not, there's not something that is talked about. Because what I was growing up in the 90s, the discourse is, we cannot afford to go in depth of what happened because this will reopen the wounds and we'll have civil war again. That's what, my parents thought, that let's live in peace. Now what history has shown is that the wounds are there, they're hurting, like trauma. You have trauma, if you don't deal with it, it acts on your body. And like with Kavanaugh, a lot of people relived trauma. And a lot of my students relived trauma, a lot of my family members relived trauma. And so the question is, well, the wounds are there, you cannot cover them up. You can deal with them and heal them, or you can leave them bleeding. And so the choice not to talk about it because it would bleed is kind of supposing they're not bleeding. But the wounds are bleeding, the shame and the humiliation and the pain is transmitted from family to family. And like my generation is marked by this dictatorship and the silence around the dictatorship and the fact that collectively, my generation didn't grasp what happened during the dictatorship. And that's a very heavy weight to carry, for me, for all of us. So I think that, yes, the discourse is like to talk about things is going to create violence. I actually think to talk about things and to recognize rights and wrongs and to do reparations, it is going to begin a healing process. There's also another debate, which is more important than the debate about the exhumation of Franco remains, which is a debate about one of the most famous policemen who tortured the political prisoners, who's called Billy El Niño. Billy El Niño was famous because when people were arrested politically, they were sent to Madrid, they were tortured for 6 months, 3 months, 1 year, and when everything could be, if they survived torture, then they would be sent to a prison, right? So this is the goal, to the south. And one of the guys who worked for the political police is Billy El Niño, and he was known for committing horrible things during torture. But this guy is retired now, and he's retired with 2 extra pensions for merit of service. So he has decorations from the Spanish army and the Spanish police, and so he's making triple money. So in the crisis we have, he's like making like 3 pensions.
And rewarded for killing people. So a lot of the victims of Billy El Niño who are finally speaking out now, because it's also a big shame to say, well, I was tortured, and people, like, it's difficult to come out and say that this happened to you. Are requesting that the government takes away these condecorations. I mean, most of us think that not only they should be taken away, these guys should be judged and put in jail. She would be accountable.
Yeah, but in Spain there was no judicial process. One of the big differences between Spain and Latin America is in Latin America the dictatorship was very, very violent. All of them. In Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, they were very violent. There was a lot of torture, but there was a big social organization, political organization of the people who, after the dictatorship, demanded a recognition of the wrongs. And people who tortured and who did wrong to be tried and put in jail. And you have Museo de la Memoria in Santiago de Chile, and you have El Monumento de la Verdad, and then you have a lot of memory places in Buenos Aires. And there's a big fight also in Brazil to have that. But in Spain, we didn't have that. In Spain, we did what we call borrón y cuenta nueva. We erase what happened, we don't talk about it. That was the agreement that was made in '79. We're not going to talk about what happened. And that, the people who live under, it's kind of living in an abusive family, where abuse has been committed, and nobody can talk about it. But the abuse is there every day.
Because the idea is not to spread dirty.
Yeah, the abuse is there every day, versus being in an abusive family where there is a family reunion and there is a decision that this person did something wrong and this person is going to be sanctioned in this way.
And they're sitting at the table.
Yeah, and so that's a little bit. So Spain is one of the, and then so another thing that got unveiled with this Catalan thing is that Catalans had the illusion that the European Union will step in. And they say, come on, government, you cannot do that. You're a democracy. And the European Union remains silent.
Yeah.
And so that's why I say the thing about European Union. I mean, I thought about it, we had no illusions. But it's also this thing about the cover the European Union has given to very racist and genocidal regimes and acts of genocide that, like in Latin America, you have a dictatorship,
You call them dictatorship.
Yeah, well,
Because in the third world,
Yeah.
you can call third world people dictators, but Europeans are civilized.
Yeah, and so like, well,
Yeah.
what is a government that doesn't respect the sovereignty of one of its regions and sends the police and puts this elected representative in jail? In any other country, like Erdogan does this. And Erdogan, when we want, we call him a dictator. When we want to make trade deals with him and to stop the refugees and to kill the Kurds, we just say he's a
And there
democrat.
are also,
Depends
there are
what we want.
military, there is military, maneuvers with
Yeah.
the U.S., Israel,
So-
and Turkey in the Mediterranean.
So one thing that has been clear is that not only the European Union, that became very clear in the early 2000s, the European Union is a union of the rich to impose austerity. And that became extremely clear in the crisis of 2008 because it was a way for Germany and France to recolonize and Greece and Portugal and Spain and put them as completely submissive economies. But not only that, it also gives political cover to acts of dictatorial character and undemocratic character inside of the European Union. And then you have the outside, so Europe is democratic, and then when you tell people, say like, I cannot believe this is happening in Europe, I say, well, Europe is not different from the rest of the world. We just have an arrogance,
I actually, before you have your hand up, I wanted to actually say a couple of more things because Franco's brigade was called the African Brigade. And he basically enlisted a whole lot of Moroccans. People did not volunteer. This was part of the colonization. The same way that France used, and we know more about that, more than what's going on, which is very interesting. Why is that the case? But France also had all these brigades where they've gotten people from the different colonies. So, for example, this is how Frantz Fanon ended up being in Algeria, because he was inducted from Martinique to serve in the French military, assigned to Algeria, became a psychologist in the Algerian hospital, and then this consciousness started getting raised as a result. MSSR the same way. So, and then also you think about what is, and then also many of the people were inducted from different places to go fight in Vietnam, the French. And so this was the colonial powers were doing this all the time. And I think it's really important to kind of connect the whole question of colonization with the ways people get recruited and so on. The other thing that I was thinking about is when you talk about the forgetfulness. Ernest Renan, very, very famous, very, very well-known essay, What is a Nation? Ernest Renan was 17th century?
19th.
19th?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yes.
17th something, no? 19th?
I think it's
Anyway,
19th, yeah.
it was what is a nation, and then in the essay he argues that in order to be a nation, people need to forget massacres, and but the question is that in order for people to heal, people really need to remember. So this is the question. He said, forget about it. So for the oppressors to forget about it is a healing process, as we saw last week, 2 weeks ago, when we saw the film about Lebanon. The Sabra and Shatila massacre, and the Israeli film by the Israeli soldier who was actually remembered killing a lot of dogs, but wouldn't remember being at Sabra and Shatila, would not remember, and is going from one place to the other, tracing everybody he served with in the invasion of Lebanon, to ask people, what did you remember? People saying, yes, you were there. It's like, no, I don't remember I was there, but you were there. So for the members of the oppressive group, forgetfulness is a good thing because it actually relieves the conscious, doesn't allow people to think about what happens to the oppressed. So this is the whole question of also thinking about, like South Africa had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A lot of people were saying it's too soon to reconcile. It's too soon. We need to actually talk more about the truth. We need to have more people being accountable and so on. So in every process, this is the question, and in Palestinian context too, many Israelis, for example, come out and say we've done something wrong and so on, which is really, really important. But is it enough? And also with like white supremacist groups here, is it enough for people to just say we've done something wrong and that's enough for repentance? Or is there something else for people to do to kind of like participate? What do people do once they recognize that they've done something wrong? And do they get the repentance from their own oppressive community, or do they get forgiveness from the people who they oppressed? So what do the victims say? I mean, the question is not what do the victimizers say in order for them to have the therapy session and actually feel good about themselves, But it's what do the oppressed people, what are the victims saying to their victimizers? Because the only time the question of the right to justice is addressed is when the people who are victimized say that it's okay with us. As long as they haven't said it's okay, it's not okay. I mean, people can forgive each other, but it's not really for. It needs to be, things need to be addressed. People need to be held accountable. Reparations need to be made. Restoration of rights need to be made before you actually can move on. You can't just talk about it and then move on. Because talking about it actually for the people who are victimized, they relive the trauma, they get victimized again and again. So I think this really, the last thing that I said was an anecdote. An anecdote from a friend of ours who is half Algerian, half French. And one time I went and got her earrings and she said, no, my ears are not pierced. And so she said, because when she was growing up, with her mother being French, they were told that the only people who pierce their ears are the domestic workers who come from Spain and from Portugal and work. So there is this whole thing about even within Europe, the stratification that is going on. I do want to, well, if we don't have time this time, we can do it on Zoom, the whole history of Palestine. I do want to do it, but I know you have your hand, Alejandro, and Jaime has his hand.
Yeah, well, what you were saying about nationalism in Europe, I thought that brought up like an interesting point, because in the late 1800s, you had everyone in Europe like wanted their own nation, right? Everyone was like, I want a nation, and they're, that's what they were fighting about. And then that's where Zionism comes from, the rampant nationalism within Europe inspired not just Theodore Herzl, but Theodore Herzl was one of the people who was like, took this like notion of nationalism as like, oh, we need to like create a nation of of Jews, right? Isn't that's am I mistaken? It looks like you're.
Yes and no, because actually he wasn't as much inspired by other nationalisms in Europe. I mean, it wasn't really. He was not. There isn't any, unless I'm mistaken. There isn't in his writings that we want to be like Garibaldi or Bismarck, or it wasn't. It was about, there is anti-Semitism, and there was definitely the pogroms, the Dreyfus trial, the scapegoating of Jews in order to kind of like resolve a capitalist crisis, because now the society was moving from feudalism to capitalism, and there was questions about who controls money. Okay, and in the feudalism, only Christians could control resources and money and so on. And it was the role was assigned to the Jews, because they were the ones who were the minority, who were actually not part of the elite of society. And now you have the transformation to capitalism, and all of a sudden now Europeans want to take over. Christian Europeans want to take over. So it's scapegoating against the minority, which is the Jews. So there was anti-Semitism rising. Dreyfus, the pogroms, everywhere else. There is a crisis that somebody needs to be blamed, and the Jews were being blamed, at least in Europe, okay? Because other places there is the colonies are going on, colonialism and so on, in other parts of the world. And I think it's also very important to learn the histories together, not to just think about what's going on in Europe, anti-Semitism, without thinking what's happening in the rest of the world, because then every history becomes exceptionalized, rather than actually thinking about the histories in terms of oppression, resistance, colonialism, and oppression on various levels, not just national, on many religious, multiple levels, thinking about them that way, because it allows us to think comparatively and not exceptionalize justice and injustice, and also not engage in the Olympics, oppression Olympics that Blanca was speaking about. But so there was this question of anti-Semitism rising, and there were there is multiple issues going on, but anti-Semitism. So what do we do about anti-Semitism? Marx, as we had discussion, Marx came up with a discussion about the whole question of civil society. He wrote an essay on, there's an essay on civil society, there's an essay on the Jewish question. Okay, and then the Bunds afterwards come during the October Revolution and discuss it. And multiple Jews have different debates, and we've talked about very big debate about what do we do about anti-Semitism, what do we do about oppression against Jews, as you do oppression against any other community. What do you do about it? What are the solutions? How do you address that? And Herzl's idea was to what he called the Jewish state, that is basically take all the Jews and put them in one place that is only restrictive to the Jews, but ethno-state. But okay, he wasn't only talking about it. It became later. It's not because some Israeli scholars.
Later. Yeah.
But he wasn't.
Yeah, he wasn't
At that
talking
time,
about
it wasn't actually thought of as an ethnicity. It was thought about Jews need to be protected. It wasn't even the more recent sophisticated debates in Zionism. Then it starts talking about Jews as not just a religious group, but also as a cultural group. Jews are part of a nationality. I mean, all of these things are much later on than Herzl. This is not what was going. Herzl was trying to figure out, what do we do with anti-Semitism? I mean, this is his aim. Now, the thing with Herzl that's different than Marx and other people and other Jewish scholars who were talking about anti-Semitism as being part of racism, that it needs to be addressed like other parts of racism, other parts of oppression. What Herzl was saying, anti-Semitism is a problem that we need to take care of, but in order to take care of it, he made a deal with European powers that we will take the Jews to another place, put them in a separate place, okay, which many anti-Zionist scholars call it a ghetto. So it's like a ghetto of our own making. So rather than the Poles coming and locking up the Jews inside the ghetto, okay, Warsaw Ghetto and other places, now it's the Jews who are going to be holding the key, to lock themselves in this state called Israel. And promised the Europeans that this would be really good because it would rid Europe of its Jewish problems. So we would take Jews to Israel, to Palestine at the time, later on becomes Israel.
Right.
And then Europe doesn't have the Jewish problem. Europe will solve this Jewish problem, and we will take and set that. So that was not, it wasn't constructed in the same theoretical or conceptual understandings of nationalism, because that was, or European nationalism. And this is where kind of like what Blanca is saying and what, in my work on Palestine, I talk about, and we talked about it also last week, about that there is multiple nationalisms. There isn't one way of thinking about nationalism, and putting everything under the same umbrella of nationalism is actually quite, it conflates history, it doesn't think about the specificities, it doesn't have the historical specificity or kind of like really even rigorous theoretical and methodological understanding. So it is not the same. It becomes later on, it gets framed in the language of nationalism, because at some point, and during decolonization era, in the 20th century, now we're moving to the 20th century, the United Nations start saying that nations who are colonized have the right to self-determination. Nations who are colonized have the right to self-determination. So it becomes it's much more opportune for the Zionism to present itself as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Thus, it is entitled to self-determination. Thus, Israel should be defended. Thus, if you are actually criticizing Israel and Zionism, you are anti-Semitic, and you are really feeding into the persecution of Jews. I mean, this is the progression of it. It's a very different kind of genealogy.
So it's not accurate to say that Zionism is European national, or was spread in European
I think when people say that, I think it's just like there is historical specificity. How Herzl came about, how the Zionists, and he also made deals with Rhodes of Southern Africa, Rhodesia, Rhodes, the colonists. He made deals with the British colonists. I mean, all of the connections, and then also the Zionist, first Zionist conference was given Argentina and Uganda. These two places were given to the Zionists to kind of, why don't you go set up a state over there? Just solve the European problem, getting rid of the Jews, okay? And the Zionists had a lot of discussion. They said, it doesn't really work because we can't establish some roots with Uganda or with Argentina. But Palestine would actually work because we can then talk about the historical roots of Judaism. Now. But at the time, a lot of people who were supporting the Zionism were not actually religious Jews. I mean, the religious Jews wasn't part of it. They brought in the question of religion and so on. So it's much more complicated than that. I don't think it is the same, we can talk more about it, but, yeah.
Well, just one more thing. Just like also to tie it back to Arab and Muslim ethnicities, like Spanish Civil War and the Syrian Civil War. I know there's a lot of controversy in drawing the parallels, but I see a lot of parallels with you have an oppressive regime that is trying to be taken over by a coalition of rebel factors, right? But then you also have other factions within the region that are have radical, like revolutionary theory enveloping in the practice too as well, with like the Kurdish like Rojava and all that. So like I don't know what like do you see the parallels, or is that because a lot of people are like, oh no, don't compare it, but I think it's fair to compare the two.
I mean, I think there are parallels in, it's a very controversial topic. But so let me talk about the things that are the same and the things that are different, in my opinion. The things that are the same, they were both dictatorships. It's like the civil war was against the monarchy, but the monarchy was not it was not torturing people or imprisoning people the same way Assad regime has been doing.
Right.
And it's true that in both places you had oppressed nationalities, if you want. Now the difference, so you would say, well, were democratic revolutions that turn into civil wars, because what happens when a revolution doesn't manage to overthrow quickly is that it polarizes society and it goes into civil war. The difference, I think, is that Syria, contrary to Spain, it's like the geopolitical context is different. Like Spain went through a civil war in a polarized world before even World War II, when you had the rise of fascism and communism. And so that polarization was translated into the civil war. And in Syria, you have the question of imperialist domination of the region, which is different. Because you have, at the same time that you have this process of democratic revolution, you have an attempt for different foreign powers to intervene in the fate of the Syrian people.
Okay.
Now, the debate would be, I'm talking of course about the United States, but also about Iran, and Russia, and Saudi Arabia, Israel. So then it becomes more complicated. And so the question is, well, self-determination is self-determination from foreign oppression and from a government that is imposed on the people. And so most of the debates around Syria come from the different understandings about the role of the Assad regime. Some people said it was an anti-imperialist regime, and it was kind of the last stronghold. And so therefore, even if it was a dictatorship, it should be supported. Other people say, well, it was not an anti-imperialist regime because it was actually implementing the same neoliberal reforms that Mubarak had implemented in rendition, and had already. That's kind of what. But I think that added complication of Syria was you didn't have so clearly in Spain. I would just say it's more complicated to understand. And then you have the evolution of the Syrian war that went for longer. So then the war has become more, even every day it goes on, it becomes a more difficult conflict to understand, take a position on, even if one needs to take a position on. So I just would say that the anti-imperialist dimension, the question of self-determination of the Syrian people, free from intervention from the United States and other imperialist powers, is a very important dimension to understand the conflict that was not so clear in Spain. That question, Spain was not an oppressed nationality or a country that had been colonized and recently acquired its independence and was on the verge of becoming a new colony. Right? That conversation was not there so clearly. I mean, today you could argue Spain is a kind of a semi-colony in Europe, but that's a different conversation.
I think I agree. I think also to add another thing is the nature of who is fighting the civil war. And in Spain, the coalition that was the front, the United Front that was fighting, is very different than what's going on in Syria too. So that also makes it quite difficult. So on one hand, yes, you have a dictator. You have a ruthless dictator. I mean, this is what Assad has done and so on historically. I mean, not only contemporarily. I mean, Syrian government supported the Tal Za'atar massacre, supported the war in the camps of Lebanon. I mean, of the Palestinians. So it's not historically it's been known to be one of. And there is historically that people get shocked about Syria, for example, or even about Iraq. About Saddam Hussein, both dictators. But then it gets constructed in the U.S., in the context we're in, as extra ruthless. But like nobody is talking about what Saudi Arabia is bombing day in and day out Yemen.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is
Yeah.
talking about Saudi Arabia treating now Jamal Khashoggi had disappeared.
Mhm.
The
That's
journalist,
creepy.
he disappeared. But you know this is not why it's always been the history.
Right.
It's not something new.
Right.
It's not something new. It's historically not, there is no possibilities. No possibilities for even a simple movement to be growing and so on. So there is this construction of whoever are the enemies of the US and the imperialist countries gets constructed as extra fascist, extra, Noriega and so on. And a lot of them are cut from the same cloth. I mean, some of them are different there, but it is. But they're good constructed as extra, like exceptionally, unbelievably fascist and ruthless and so on. And what's going on in Egypt with Sisi? And so I think it's kind of, that's one aspect that needs to be acknowledged, okay? The other aspect is who's on the ground fighting. And there is a serious problem with the people who are fighting the Syrian regime in Syria, that a lot are very much connected with the United States. And there was this genuine movement, uprisings that took place from the young kids in Dir'a who was writing, from the poet whose throat was slashed. I mean, there was amazing epical stories of people who were resisting, who were rising up and so on.
2011.
And then pretty soon, 2011, 2012, pretty soon the US intervenes and actually starts crushing and arming people. And there is all these groups, and it's not just ISIS, it's all these groups who are being funded by the US, who are giving support and cover by Israel, who are being treated in Israel and so on. And this whole international coalition and so on. And what's really scary is that the way the imperialists construct regime change is not what we who want justice want regime change. It is very different from each other. People in the Arab world, as everywhere else, are entitled to have democratic regimes, are entitled to be able to live in dignity, are entitled to live in freedom. The revolutions were all about freedom, dignity, and bread. From Tunisia elsewhere. I mean, this is the new.
What about the Kurds?
Uprising. Hold on, I'm coming to that. Okay, because they're not Arabs.
Right.
They're their own nationality.
But they're Muslim ethnicity, right?
Well, not all. But yeah, but it's not. But not all are Muslims.
No.
Not all the Kurds.
Right.
Okay, so there is multiple. I'll come.
Yeah.
So I think this is kind of like something that. I was hoping to teach the course of Arab revolutions and social change next semester, but it's kind of like we're debating to do Palestine or not. You let me know before it gets too late. Yeah?
Yeah, it was really, I really liked learning about the Syrian and Egyptian.
So, I mean, there is a whole lot of history. So this is kind of like the recent wave. Then you go to the Kurdish question is another question. The Kurdish question has to do with the question of the national minorities in the Arab world, among Arabs, well, not just the Kurds. You have the Amazigh in North Africa. You have multiple nationalities and groups and so on. The Kurdish people are not only in Syria. Kurdish people are in Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, right? And history has developed in different places differently. Now, specifically, the most evident ones are what is going on today in Syria. It's actually not as prominent, even though in Rojava there are Kurds who are fighting, but it's not as historically as the question of, especially in Turkey. Okay, the biggest people that are organized, and the reason I'm saying this because we actually went in 2013, participated in a conference, a women's conference organized by Kurdish people in Diyarbakir, AMED, and we traveled throughout and we visited with the mothers of the fighters when the fighters were withdrawing, and there was a peace agreement between the Öcalan, PKK, and the Turkish government, and then it fell apart, of course, because the Turkish government was going to. Yeah, we can talk about. I mean, this was a very big thing, and we went to the grave of Sakina, who was one of the founders, who was assassinated, and we went to her hometown, their scene. There was a lot of discussions, so we can, and actually it was during also the same protest of Gezi Park, in Taqsim and Istanbul. Anyway, so this is a genuine question of self-determination. In Iraq, the Kurdish question has been very much overshadowed by some of the leaders collaborating with the CIA and the US and Israel, okay? And there is the oil fields. that the US and the imperialist powers need to put their hands on. Now the recent election of the president of Iraq is Kurd, by the way. Now, what is that going to do to the Kurdish question? We do not know. I mean, this is kind of like, it doesn't necessarily mean just because a Kurd, just because Obama became a president, that means that we end anti-black racism in this country and erase the history of slavery. It's just, I mean, just to make it real, okay? Now, so there is this discussions between various groups of the Kurdish community about what do people want. Do they want to have a republic of Kurds all over? Or do they want to have within various countries and so on? In different places there is different questions. There are questions of language, there is question of culture, question of people being able to learn and so on. We witnessed a lot of this stuff in Turkey that was really quite fascistic, and it reminded us of the settlements. The centuries inside of within Kurdish areas, I mean the oppression, the prosecution of people who were running for office under terrorism charges. We attended a tribunal of terrorism of people who are running for office, who were actually elected officials in the municipalities
Turkish.
in Turkey, yeah, in Diyarbakir, in AMED, which is now destroyed. I mean, completely destroyed. Nobody talks about that. Nobody actually like even thinks about what's going on. Thousands of people are in prison and thousands of people are tortured. And so like if you even take, let's say, a class on torture and prison, you will see there is like, I mean, this is some of the stuff I grew up with because of the big question, the prison question in Palestinian context. So there is a lot, this is kind of like where we actually enter into different parts, whether we're talking about Spain, whether we're talking about Argentina, we're talking about Chile, we're talking about Brazil, you know, El Salvador. I mean, all of this stuff is about the histories of imprisonment, because you read about all the memoirs or what's going on, and people know which are the prisons in which area and so on. And each you know, regime is very inventive and very creative in devising torture methods and so on. So this is, and I think this is part of the stuff, maybe we will be able to talk about it on the October 25th. When we do, maybe we won't have enough time, you know, the prisoner event. But this is some of the stuff that's actually quite there. And they were trying to imprison people, I mean, hold them on terrorism charges. We went and attended, we were observers. We got permission to attend the trial. And it was elected officials, people who were elected, but they were holding them on terrorism charges. And now it's much worse than that. So that's what's happening. So there was a discussion. Do they want to?
Were they convicted?
Some of them were.
Oh, wow.
And now some of them, we don't even know where they are. And some of the women who organized that conference, some of them spent 12 years in prison. Some, I mean, they were really like, there was one woman who had just started walking because of the torture she spent, I mean, it's very bad. People do not think about it the same way. It's like that what Blanca was saying about Turkey, Erdogan, and what happened with not only Erdogan, historically the fascist Turkish regime of Ataturk, that was quite brutal, quite military dictatorship. People do not even know about that. It's kind of like it's very small blind spots of history. It's like little bit here, little bit there, little bit here, and people have very short memories, and they only think that Arab Revolution started in 2011. Nobody knows about the history of things that have been suppressed again and again, like Bahrain and Oman in the 70s by the US, Israel, and the Shah of Iran. You know, came together and suppressed all these uprisings. I mean, all of this stuff is not known. All these histories are not known. Now you come to the people in Rojava are actually part. They are connected to the PKK and the people who are in Turkey.
YPG.
Which is very interesting, because that's why Turkey also wants to work against the Syrian regime, but doesn't want the people in Rojava because they are supporting the other people. And one of the women we've met, actually, and also we met her actually the World Social Forum in Tunisia in 2013, right? Yeah, in 2013, was the mayor of this little city on the border. It's in Syria. It's on the border of Syria and Turkey. Right. And the Turkish government was going to build, I forget what the name is. They were trying to build a wall, just like the wall in Palestine, and just like the wall, Trump wants to build in Mexico, and the one in Kashmir, and the one that they want to build in Sabta and Melilla, and to prevent immigrants from Africa to go to Spain. Okay, so there is all. So they were trying to build a wall, and what happened is that the mayor, and I'm trying to remember her name, Nabila, I think. No, not Nabila. She went on hunger strike, and she tied herself she chained herself to the barbed wire and so on, and then the Turkish government had to actually take down I mean, literally, we were following day by day, because we've met her. We met her in the World Social Forum in Tunisia, and then we went and we were hosted by the Kurdish women and the Kurdish people in Diyarbakir, in AMED, and she was one of the people who was there. And she was part of the people who was at the border between Syria and, so there is also this discussion has moved, whether do people want to have a state in all over, Kurdish state? Or do they want to have self-determination in various, areas?
Because Rojava is not the idea isn't a state. It's the creation of a new society of like abandoning nation states completely, and democratic confederalism. No.
Yes and no, because this is part of like Öcalan's writing.
Right.
Okay, Öcalan has been in prison 16 years in maximum solitary confinement, reading and writing on his own without interaction with any other human beings. And there is a question of what happens, what is the product, what kind of intellectual product comes out when a person is held up by themselves, not being able to discuss with other people. I mean, I have all the books in Arabic, they gave them to me, all these books from when we were in 2010, but so this not, the idea of a new society, is it just in Rojava? Is it something that the Spanish Civil War, isn't it in Palestine too, isn't it with Batista?
Totally.
Is it happening here? So it is not just in one place. Again, I don't want us to exceptionalize or idealize Palestine or Rojava or anywhere else, because these struggles are happening everywhere. And I think it's really important to kind of say, what is the unifying thing? What are the differences that are going on? And so there is a lot of debate within the Kurdish communities, whether you're talking about the various cities in the areas in the region, or whether you're talking about people in Germany, people in France, people here. There is different places that are having different discussions about and I can tell you more. I mean, we had a very big discussion about when they did the peace thing. So we were saying, remember Oslo. Remember Oslo. We will tell you what's happening in Palestine, and you need to actually think about, do you really want to trust the oppressors to kind of like basically dictate the terms and so on? And sure enough, the Turkish government cancelled the peace agreement, which the Kurds are the ones who came, and which is the same as also the Basque too. They came and they offered, and then they declared them terrorists, and they're going around. Even when they were elected, we were in the Basque area for the Palestinian Youth Movement summer school in 2010, and we visited Guernica. And one of the problems about Guernica, the Museum of Peace, is that it actually does give a different shape, very rosy picture about, Anyway, I'm not going to talk about, no, I was going to talk about the 3639, but we don't have time. We have 15 more minutes, so I want to take advantage of the fact that Blanca is with us, Professor Nise, and Jaime wanted to say, and can you say a few things about this, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade?
I could.
Can you? Briefly.
Well, but before I did, I wanted to, today in Blanca, another aspect of the Civil War in Spain and the question of accountability was the question of what the Franco regime did with taking babies away from Republicans. And so today, there was an article about this in the New York Times, because there is one 80-year-old doctor who was infamous in facilitating the kidnapping of babies from Republican parents. And he is being challenged and held to account, but the court ruled that even though he is guilty, the what do you call it? The statute of limitations it takes effect. So therefore, so that this can you imagine?
Justice expires.
Can you imagine all of those people who have come to discover that they were kidnapped? And this is also what happened in Latin America. In Argentina, in Chile, we have that history where there is much more accountability, as Blanca said. So just, I don't know if
Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and then we'll come.
But let the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, real quick, first, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was part of the international movement to support the Spanish Republican against the Franco-fascist effort. It was organized by the international communist movement, specifically the Soviet Union, But the significant thing about it is that people your age, from all over the world, actually went to Spain to fight. And from all over the world, from every part of the world, from Europe, all of Europe, from Latin America, there were representatives.
There were Arabs.
There were Arabs,
Palestinians, yeah.
Algerians, Syrians, people from Palestine. All of this is history. So that close to 30,000 to 40,000 people joined the Spanish Republican Army in trying to fight back against Franco. Maybe 15 to 20,000 died in the course of it. It was an incredible moment historically. In many ways, the Spanish Civil War was the precursor and seen as the way of the precursor that opened up fascism of Italy and Germany. There's a lot more history to it. There's more like controversies, both the inadequacy of the defense and the whole question of the Soviet Union, both positive and negative, the role of the communist parties around the world at the time, in contrast to the anarchist movement, which was also a very significant thing. All of it reflected itself in the U.S. The people that came from the U.S., over 3,000, both men, women, black and white, at a time when the U.S. was segregated totally, and blacks were not able to be in the army, let alone be officers. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and they called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which today we would, you put that in the quote unquote.
It's the same way that the Israeli Communist Party, which made up of Palestinians mostly, would hold the Israeli flag. I mean,
Yeah. So these things, but it was an incredible thing that 3,000 U.S. citizens, for lack of a better word, actually went to Spain and fought together. Black were able to play leading roles as officers, as men and women, and it really shaped the whole particular generation, both within Spain and outside Spain. And the reason it's significant is because, as in many parts of history, there are particular moments that shape a generation. There was a generation of young people shaped and molded and impacted by that period that carried over into the 60s. And then a new generation of people learned from them and carried on the struggle in the 60s, leading on to many things that we have spoken about. If you really would like, and just intellectually, I mean, this is, the writings of Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is a really good novel. I mean, he wasn't the greatest writer, but this is a very moving novel. For Whom the Bell Tolls. There was George Orwell, the famous 1984 and Animal Farm. All of these people of that caliber were all impacted by it and influenced and participated. And interesting, and just to show you that, I was looking at the Wikipedia, just to show you again how history is shaped. They'll talk about everyone who was there from Europe, but they don't mention anyone else. They don't mention Latin American participants. They don't mention African participants.
Or Arabs. Yeah.
Arab participants. It's all, they listed countries from Europe. But meantime, there was like I know from Cuba, there was like 4,000 people who went to fight in Spain. I mean, yeah, in Spain. And that was the case in Latin America, not the actual, don't know all the numbers, but there is a very good documentary actually that was made in 1984, which you can look it up in Google it. It's called The Good Fight.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was a really good 1984, and
Let's put it on the
it's a
class.
really, I haven't seen it in a while. I'm probably would find more objectionable politics now, but it was a really good documentary. It really shows why people felt the importance of stopping fascism in Spain. Also, I think significantly, and many times I've wondered, and I've had conversations with other people, why is it that the 1936-39 rebellion in Palestine is not really well known, or has not really been really explored and expanded upon. And sometimes you wonder, was it because it was overshadowed by other international developments, whether the question of the Spanish Civil War, the question of the rise of fascism? How is it that a significant rebellion has been really not documented?
By workers.
Yeah.
Led by workers, led by peasants, both armed and and civil social justice campaigns. How is it that has been so little documented as a significant moment in history? And that's always a question that I think needs to be looked at. But definitely the Civil War in Spain, the question of the international brigades. I mean, really, it's hard to envision how that period, we haven't had anything like that. The Black Panther Party at one moment did say that they were willing to go and send, following this example, and maybe a little more, maybe it was mostly rhetorical, but they did say that they were willing to go and send people to fight with the Vietnamese. They did make that declaration. Now, the actual reality was a different question, but they did, and that's the spirit of.
And I want to actually, before I pass it over to Blanca, make connections with Palestine on multiple things. One from oral history. Abraham Lincoln Brigade members used to participate in almost every demonstration in solidarity with Palestine in New York. They always used to come, and they would be, the first would be the indigenous, then behind them were the Abraham Lincoln Brigade veterans, and then there will be the Young Koreans United. I mean, this is kind of like, and I actually have some of the videos that are the only, like, nobody has them. There was only one rescued and so on. So this is also, but I think also it goes back, Jaime talks about 1936-39, and one of the examples that we will talk about the internationalists is Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who was a Syrian peasant from Syria who went to Palestine and fought with the Palestinians against the Zionists and the British, and was killed by the British colonists as a result. And this, I would just say, and people will say, oh, sounds familiar, yeah, because in Gaza, Hamas calls its missiles Qassam missiles, and it's Qassam Brigade. But also Qassam is the name of the son of Marwan Barghouti, one of the most prominent Palestinian prisoners in prison. So the Qassam is actually a very important name in Palestine, and everybody talks about it. But it also talks about the ways in which guerrilla warfare was being fought. Because Izzuddin al-Qassam comes to Palestine and organizes people who will fight against organizes people in different parts. And this also takes me to the question of the current contemporary Palestinian revolution, which I was, maybe tomorrow I'll be able to speak about it, but I want Madonna to speak more in the class. The 1960s, fighters came from all over the world and joined, women and men, and joined the Palestinian movement. There were Iranians, there were Kurds. There are some people that we met and they were stuck speaking Arabic, and I said, how do you speak Arabic in Kurdistan? And this, oh, I was in Beirut. I know there is a lot of people you meet, and then people will tell you, our own Professor Alejandro Murguia was one of the people who actually fought, was with the Palestinians. He was with the Sandinistas. There is multiple people throughout the world. We were at and I mentioned that we were at a funeral of this Italian guy who was fighting with the Palestinians. I think I mentioned it yesterday, or I mentioned it last week. He fought with the Palestinians, and then all of a sudden, we were in Lebanon. We were just in Lebanon for a conference, right? And then we were invited by Palestinians in Shatila camp to go to the funeral. And here's this guy, he was fighting with the Palestinians, went back to Italy, set up his family, everything else, and comes back to Beirut on May 15th, on the anniversary of the Nakba, and says, I'm coming home. And he dies on the anniversary of the Israeli occupation of 67. And they want to bury him, and his daughter and son come from Italy at the funeral. And they bury him in the Shatila PLO, because there is 3 cemeteries in Shatila refugee camp. One is for the victims of the massacre in 1982, that was by the Phalange. The second one is for the war of the camps that were Lebanese, and Palestinians fought against other Palestinians, killed over 800 people supported by the Syrian regime. And then the third one, the biggest one, is the PLO. It's a plot of land that the PLO had bought and actually set up the graves for various heroes. And if you go, and I think I mentioned, if we go, you can see each one, you stop and you like, and he's buried there, and he was buried there because there was a Tunisian fighter who had died fighting with the Palestinians, and his family wanted to exhume his remains. So they took his bones and they gave them to his family in Tunisia to be buried near his family. So there was a space opened because there is no space in that cemetery anymore. And a few years ago, the Lebanese government was going to take it over, the right-wing groups, and people fought, and now it's protected. So there is a lot of these histories of these kind of like people fighting with each other, struggling with each other, that we do not know. Some of it fighting with arms, some of it fighting internationally. People who are going to Palestine are coming and speaking to us about it. People who are going different places, in Nicaragua, to Mexico. People who are going to fight also, not internationally also, but also here. When people are going from San Francisco State University to fight against gentrification in the Mission or in Oakland. People who are going to the prisons where people who are undocumented are being held. I mean, this is all about people coming together and actually fighting things that are not quote unquote necessarily called their own nationalistic things. And the other thing that I thought is really important to think about that is that when we're talking about what's happening in Spain, we also, a lot of people know Gramsci and think about Gramsci, and they do not know where Gramsci came from. And he was also at the same time in Italy. He was killed by Mussolini, and he was one of the people who wrote in prison. So this, when we talk about, there's a lot of things that are connected, that I think if we think about thematically about certain themes, we can think about things better than if we are talking about them within kind of like only nationalistic or ethnicities, or, you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't, and I'm not saying that, of course, you can see this is really important, but we need to think about all of these things together. And I'm going to turn it to Blanca. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make a brief comment about the International Brigade, which, I mean, I think the army, the popular militias on the side of the Civil War, on the Republican side, were, of course, internationalist in character, but I think the thing you mentioned, that women and men were fighting, is very important, because women were not allowed to fight on the other. And the question of fighting was also a question of political equality, right? It was usually...
I'm sorry, because I want you to finish. I'm just going to say one thing, that no pasaran was a scream by everybody. And actually, I was like reviewing things, and I read a bunch of articles in Arabic that they say, oh, some people think that this is something we invent, and they say in Arabic, "Lam yamurru," but it actually was a cry by this leader who was a journalist, right?
Yeah.
And in Lourdes.
Dolores,
yeah.
Apasionada.
Anyway, so that. So anyway, continue.
Yeah. So, but I think that was because usually women are do the auxiliary tasks, so they prepare the food and in the nursing. But I mean, in the militias, there was a very equal division of labor, and also was a very important part was the bottom-up structure of the army, because the soldiers will elect their officers. And I say that because, like, you could say, why is a civil war? But the values that are mobilized, even in the making of the war, as horrible as this could sound, were opposite values. Well, on the one hand, you had the belief in freedom, in self-determination, in democratic organization of the army. And when the militias will free the different towns, they will start reorganizing production, they will expropriate the land, they will, you know, like most of the northern part of Aragon and then Catalonia, they were ruled by 2-3 years by the popular militias, and they had established their own popular economies where they have their own currencies, and everybody was fed, and everybody. This is in the middle of the war. In the middle of the war, they were creating a new society, but at the same time, they had to have an organization to be able to fight the states and the other army that wanted to wipe them out of the map. And I think that's important because what is important for us is, like, we need to do a lot of things to fight for justice. And I think it's important that we keep our values while we do these things. It does matter how do we conduct conversations, how do we organize classes, how do we organize a rally, who speaks, or how the relations we establish among ourselves, and that is make it that the two sides are not equal, because it's not just words. There is a different different social relations are being created in some the pro-Trump demonstrations and the anti-fascist demonstrations. Like they're not just two demonstrations with two different messages.
Not two sides.
Yeah, no, and I say this because example you give, this is what also the Civil War was about. It was about two visions for society. That doesn't take away the horrors of the war, but it does allow us to have critical and human sensibility to what's happening in the struggle for justice. And I just wanted to finish with that. And thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. This is really amazing. Thank you for your time coming with us. Do you want to say anything, students? Professor Nisei?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so you can comment. You have the weekly discussion. You can comment and say what you think. Thank you.